Chapter 18 of Religion and Health. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Religion and Health by James Joseph Walsh. Chapter 12. Nervous Disease. Just as with regard to insanity, there is a very common impression that religion increases the amount of nervous disease in the world, and is responsible for a great deal of what has been called hysteria. Not a few who think they have a right to an opinion in this matter, and some of them are physicians, though usually they are rather young, are quite ready to assert that religion is a fruitful source of nervous symptoms and very often of rather serious nervous conditions. We saw in the chapter on insanity how false is the prevalent impression as to religion producing tendencies to insanity, though of course a great many insane people have religious delusions. It is very much the same with nervous diseases. Many nervous people pay a certain amount of attention to religion, and not a few of them cling to straws of hope that they may be able to overcome their neurotic tendencies by superficial attention to prayer or to some practices of religion which they seem to look upon about in the same light as patent medicines recommended for the cure of nervous diseases. People who are deeply religious, however, very seldom suffer from nervous affections, and they have in their religion the most beneficent of helpful resources, if by nature, that is, by heredity or unfortunate development, they have neurotic tendencies. So far from religion increasing nervous disease, then, it has exactly the opposite effect. We have a number of testimonies to this purport from prominent neurologists, many of whom were themselves not believers in religion, but who recognized its influence for good over others. Such expressions are to be found in the writings of men of every nationality. Not infrequently, in spite of their own religious affiliations, they acknowledge what a profound influence certain forms of religion have over certain people. These testimonies have been multiplying in our medical literature in recent years, because apparently physicians have come to appreciate, by contrast, the influence of good of religion over some of their patients, since they see so many sufferers from nervous diseases who have not this source of consolation to which to recur. In America, we have a number of such testimonies. In his Self-Help for a Nervous Woman, Dr. John K. Mitchell of Philadelphia, who may be taken to represent in this matter the Philadelphia School of Neurologists, to which his father lent such distinction, said, "It is certainly true that considering as examples two such separated forms of religious belief as the Orthodox Jews and the strict Roman Catholics, one does not see as many patients from them as one might be expected from their numbers, especially when it is remembered that Jews as a whole are very nervous people, and that the Roman Catholic includes in this country among its members numbers of the most emotional race in the world. Of only one sect can I recall no example. It is not in my memory that a professing Quaker ever came into my hands to be treated for nervousness. If the opinion I have already stated so often is correct, namely that want of control of the emotions and an overexpression of the feelings are prime causes of nervousness, then the fact that discipline of the emotions is a lesson early and constantly taught by their friends would help to account for the infrequency of this disorder among them, and adds emphasis to the belief in such a causation. In writing a textbook of psychotherapy 8 years ago, one of the appendices was devoted to the relation between religion and psychotherapy. One of the paragraphs, written for physicians, and I may say that it has been read by many thousands of them, puts my own opinion on the dual subject of the nexus between religion, insanity, and nervous disease as succinctly as I can hope to put it. There is no doubt that an abiding sense of religion does much for people in the midst of their ailments, and, above all, keeps them from developing those symptoms due to nervous worry and solicitude which so often are more annoying to the patient than the actual sufferings he or she may have to bear. While religion is often said to predispose to certain mental troubles, it is now well appreciated by psychiatrists that it is not religion that has a tendency to disturb the mind, but a disequilibrated mind has a tendency to exaggerate out of all reason its interest in anything that it takes up seriously. Whether the object of the attention be business, or pleasure, or sexuality, or religion, The unbalanced mind pays too much attention to it, becomes too exclusively occupied with it, and this overindulgence helps to form a vicious circle of unfavorable influence. While many people in their insanity, then, show exaggerated interest in religion, this is only like other exaggerated interests of the disequilibrated, and religion itself is not the cause, but only a coincidence in the matter. Some who are interested particularly in this subject, on reading this will at once revert to the fact that scruples are extremely common among the religiously inclined, and that these are, after all, as a rule, only nervous symptoms which are surely fostered by religion. To say this, however, is to misapprehend the real meaning of scruples. The word is a very old one, and means a little sharp stone, as if in trying to make progress the scrupulous found themselves hindered by having to walk over little sharp stones which so disturbed them that they were hampered in getting on. Above all, scruples put them into a state of mind where they hesitate as to whether they can go on at all or not. The subject of scruples was very thoroughly worked out and carefully described by the older spiritual writers centuries ago. They wrote elaborate treatises on it, while it was not until our own time that physicians, by their careful study of corresponding conditions entirely apart from religion, came to appreciate that these conditions of the spiritual life were only expressions of a rather common set of tendencies altogether independent of religion. They are prone to develop in people with certain physical and mental characteristics, who are possessed of dispositions and nervous systems particularly likely to be the subject of these hesitancies and doubts and difficulties, for which there is very little basis in actuality. The whole chapter of phobias, and the other chapter on obsessions, and the third on what the French call la folie de doute, the doubting mania of our modern textbooks of neurology, are really so many chapters in the literature of scruples of the old time, now transferred to textbooks on functional nervous diseases. Some nervous people who are religiously inclined get into a very disturbed state of mind from the fear that they may commit sin almost unknown to themselves, or that they may be in sin unawarely and cut off from their Creator, and they may become extremely miserable as a consequence. This is, after all, a very familiar picture to the neurologist accustomed to see patients suffering from functional nervous diseases. I have patients who suffer quite as much from the dread of dirt as these scrupulous people do from the dread of sin. Women often suffer from this dread of dirt. Misophobia is a scientific name derived from the Greek, to an exaggerated degree. A woman patient of mine makes it extremely uncomfortable for the conductors on the streetcars because, for fear of contaminating her hands, she dreads to touch the handlebars by which she could mount or descend easily. This adds greatly to the risks she takes every time she boards a car. She is constantly washing her hands to get the dirt off, so that in cold weather she sets up severe skin irritations and makes herself very uncomfortable. I have a male patient who would not touch the handle of my door for the world, and whom successive maids have come to know very well because he stands outside the outer door and has to have that as well as the inner door opened for him. He has said to me over and over again, "Doctor, don't ask me to shake hands with you, because you shake hands with so many people." I have seen him standing outside of a large department store with the temperature around 0, waiting for someone to open the door so that he might slip in without touching it. Nor are such states of mind confined to the uneducated. On the contrary, they are commonest among those who have a good education and are quite sensible in other things. Obsessions were originally described as super-religious states of mind in which some idea assumed a terrorizing character. The victims of them dread that they might commit some awful crime, and as a consequence were profoundly miserable. Instead of being confined to religion, such mental states are quite common in conditions altogether apart from religious feelings. Women read of a mother killing her child in some awful way, or perhaps accidentally poisoning it or burning it badly with some escharotic external application. They become obsessed with the idea that they may do something of this kind and fear that they may not be able to resist the suggestion. Medical literature is full of such cases. A typical case is described by Tanguy on his textbook on insanity. A young married woman suffered from nervous exhaustion after her first childbirth. She watched day by day her husband cutting up meat for his parrots with a pair of scissors, and the action filled her with disgust, which later increased to positive horror. Thus a repulsive obsession was produced, and this, in turn, engendered the morbid suggestion to cut the tongue of her dearly loved child in the same way. The fear that she would not be able to resist this suggestion made the suggestion more vivid, and the idea more imperative, causing an agonizing struggle each time. Then there are accounts, some of them most poignant, from Catholic patients of my own, who were sure that some time, while in the midst of their devotions, or even at the very reception of the sacraments, they would blaspheme. They are people who fear that every pious act of theirs may just expose them to the risk of committing some awful sacrilege. Almost needless to say, such states have nothing at all to do with religion, and when similar conditions occur among the religious-minded, they must be attributed to the general neurotic condition and not to the incidental religious tendencies. The doubting mania occurs among the religious-minded when they keep on fearing that they have not done something that they should do. Some of these individuals get into a profoundly miserable and disturbed state of mind, but that must not be blamed on religion. This sad state of mind in people who have no religion at all is extremely familiar to the neurologist, and it has no necessary connection with religious practice or religious belief. I have a patient who has been coming to me for many years now from a city in the Middle West. He is a broker, and every time there is a panic in the money market, I am almost sure to see him. Whenever he gets very much disturbed over business matters, as is likely to happen in panic times, he develops a very striking folie de doute, or doubting mania. He will take a letter to a post-box, and go back 3 or 4 times, first to see if by chance he did not drop it on the way, secondly to be sure it did not get caught in the slot. Then, if the letter is important, he will go back to see if perchance there may not be some bolts or other obstructions on the top of the box that may catch it and delay its collection. I have even known him to wait for some time at the post-box to see if the postman might not possibly drop it when he came to collect the mail. But then he does other things just as foolish. Occasionally he will get home from his office and suddenly have the feeling that he forgot to lock his safe. He will go back, and then get part way uptown when he is overcome by the fear that he may not have locked the door after him as he came out. At times, when his folie de doute is at its worst, he has been known to go back 3 or 4 times to close windows or for some other trivial reason. When he is in reasonable good condition, there is very little of this state of mind manifest, but he can make himself supremely miserable when the obsession is on him. It is often said that the declaration by the Church of the idea of possession by the devil rather encouraged the development of certain mental and nervous states and thus fostered neurotic manifestations of many kinds. This whole question of the possibility of direct diabolic influence over mankind, that is, of some evil spirit deeply influencing certain human beings, is yet a matter that is not nearly so settled as a great many physicians who have not been following scientific work in allied lines seem to think. So distinguished a scientist as Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer with Darwin of the theory of natural selection, had the feeling that spirits interfered much more in human affairs than a great many people were willing to admit, and that the evil spirits probably could, under certain circumstances, deeply affect individuals. Professor Barrett of Trinity College, Dublin, is even more outspoken in what he has to say in this regard, and now there is a very general feeling amongst those who have investigated spiritualistic phenomena most carefully, that if spirits do actually communicate directly with men, it is commonly not the spirits who claim to do the communicating who are actually present. Almost needless to say any such conclusion as this would, if maintained, throw even scientists back to the old idea of diabolism, which the Church, on the strength of many centuries of experience, still teaches. One thing is perfectly sure, that if overzeal on the part of certain ecclesiastics rather encouraged neurotic manifestations because of the alluringly suggestive quality of the thought of diabolic possession, they did no more than physicians did in more modern times by their suggestive methods in the study of hysteria. A great French neurologist of today has pointed out that major hysteria, as studied by French neurologists of a generation ago, has practically disappeared, or occurs very rarely in our days because it is no longer unconsciously suggested to patients by physicians that these major symptoms are being looked for. Overzeal in medicine raised up a whole series of symptoms that had no existence except in the heated imagination of their patients under the influence of strong suggestions. Another extremely interesting phase of this subject is that in the old days many of the sensible ecclesiastics and some of the civil authorities came to recognize that people supposed to be possessed of evil spirits could be cured of their condition, not infrequently, by roundly whipping them. Sir Thomas More particularly called attention to how much good could be effected in this way. In writing an article on Psychoneurosis and the War, International Clinics, Volume 2, Series 29, I called attention to this in a paragraph that may be helpful in the understanding of the discussion of diabolic influence. It has been the custom for many years now, indeed for more than a generation, to think that the old-fashioned methods of treating many of the psychoneuroses by punishment and the infliction of pain were founded on an entirely wrong principle. Sir Thomas More, for instance, tells the story of a number of folks in his time who suffered from rather serious complaints. Some of them were dumb and some deaf, and some thought they could not see, and others could not walk. He says that some people considered them possessed of the devil, and that it was the presence of this very undesirable spirit that hampered their activities in various ways, and made it impossible for them to use their powers properly. The description of the cases makes it very clear that he is referring to hysterical conditions of various kinds, and the sequel as to the successful treatment which he says was frequently employed on them more than confirms the inference of hysteria and demonstrates the very definite hysterical character of the affection. Many a physician down through the ages has been inclined to think that these people were possessed of a bad spirit of some kind, even though he might not be quite ready to think that a personal devil has taken hold of them and was seriously hampering their functions. We recognize that the real trouble is with their own spirit, to which may be applied whatever epithets come to mind, and no one will think them exaggerations. This spirit has lost its control of their activities, rendering them incapable of exercising their functions properly. There is a very widespread tradition, which has found its way into medical literature especially, that the fervent practice of religion in women has a very definite tendency to make them neurotic, particularly when religious devotion is associated with mortification and fasting. It is supposed to be serious in its effects. It is accustomed to make references to such pious women as St. Catherine of Siena and St. Teresa of Spain as typically exemplifying this neuroticizing tendency. Anyone who really knows the lives of either of these women would not be likely to think that they were neurotic in any proper sense of that word at all. Both of them were not weak, but had immensely strong characters, veritable towers of strength in supremely difficult times, supporting not only their own heavy burdens, but helping others around them to bear theirs. Of Catherine of Siena, Swinburne, the English poet, surely not a sanctimonious person, whose sentimentality might lead to admiration for the hysterical bizarre, but who had studied her career because so many incidents in her life had been the subject of great paintings by a number of the greatest painters of Italy, said, "Then in her sacred saving hands she took the sorrows of the lands. With maiden palm she lifted up the sick time's blood embittered cup, and in her virgin garment furled the faint limbs of a wounded world. Clothed with calm love and clear desire, she went forth in her soul's attire, a missive fire." The great hospital at Siena was rebuilt in honor of Catherine shortly after her death because of the fact that she had spent many years of her comparatively brief life there. She died at 32 in personal service of all kinds to the patients suffering from every manner of disease, even leprosy, who were in the institution. The lepers were housed apart from the others. She placated so many feuds among the noble families of Siena, feuds that were the cause of as many murders as the worst of our own in Kentucky, that she was asked to be the envoy of peace when cities were at war, and it was she who eventually, by her influence, brought the popes back from Avignon to Rome, and thus put an end to the great disorders on the Italian peninsula. St. Teresa, the great Spanish mystic of the 16th century, the other horrible example held up even by some neurologists of hysterical tendencies due to religion and mortification, proves, when studied in real life, to have been at least as great and strong a character as Catherine of Siena. She well deserves the name of saint as a leader in unselfishness, but besides she had a fine sense of humor. That is what neurotic people lack above all, a sense of humor. All sorts of distinguished men in the Spain of her time, and in the 16th century Spain was by far the greatest country in Europe, her sovereigns ruling most of Europe and the greater part of America, and the nation gave birth to great art, literature, architecture, and philosophy, turned to consult St. Teresa in their difficulties. She wrote a series of books that have been republished in every cultured language in Europe at least once a century ever since, and our own generation has been sedulous in the study of Teresa's writings. No less than a dozen lives of hers have been written in English in the 20th century. This Spanish lady, who died 350 years ago, is still a very living force in the world. Owing to the special conditions under which much of my work is accomplished, I am brought in contact with a great many religious women every year. For some 20 years, I have spent some days each summer with groups of religious communities where large numbers are assembled for special intellectual and spiritual work. The Mother Superior has often consulted me with regard to some of her daughters who had special nervous manifestations, but it is a never-ending source of surprise to find how few of them suffer from the nervous symptoms so common in our time. Considering the fact that they spend their lives very largely indoors, that they live on very simple food, and sometimes I have been inclined to think with scarcely enough nor sufficient variety to make them capable of the amount and demanding nature of the work that they do, fewer of them suffer from nervous symptoms or affectations than women of the same class who are living at home and on whom the demands are not nearly so strenuous. Their religious duties, instead of being in any way a drain on their nerve force, though I have often heard it said that teachers ought not to be required to give quite so much time to their religious duties, represent a reservoir of energy from which they draw strength, and above all placidity of mind, and consequent power to accomplish more than would otherwise be the case. My duties often bring me into contact with numbers of sisters during their hours of recreation, so called, and I do not think that I have ever seen a happier, heartier group of people than they make during their periods of relaxation. I have always considered it a privilege to share recreation after dinner or supper with a dozen sisters when I am lecturing in one of the smaller towns, and we have often laughed so heartily together that I have sometimes wondered what the neighbors would think of us. People with a sense of humor like this are not likely to have hysterical tendencies. Nervousness is at bottom selfishness, and there is always a great deal of conceit in it. Religious women are likely to be humble, and that means much in keeping them from various magnifications of their ego which so often result in nervous and mental symptoms. I have often ventured to say that I was quite sure that a religious house, especially where there were many young people, in which laughter came easy and was heard frequently during the times appropriate for it, was sure to be a place of real spirituality and happiness. I have often dared to remind them that the one place where one hears no real laughter, though sometimes sounds are made resembling it, is an insane asylum. People who are ready to laugh are usually eminently sane. Above all, they do not take themselves too seriously. It is taking oneself and one's feelings too seriously that is the root of a great deal of nervousness and mental disturbance in this little world of ours. Certainly the discipline of heart and mind and body, and the feeling of satisfaction from duty well done that comes in connection with that complete sacrifice of themselves in a great religious cause which members of religious orders make, so far from predisposing them to nervous disease, has just exactly the opposite effect. Nervous diseases, instead of being fostered or fomented by religion, are on the contrary repressed rather effectually and equilibrium given even to those in whom some hereditary elements might have proved disturbing. This does not mean that all the religious-minded are free from nervous symptoms, and it must not be forgotten that not everyone who says, "Lord, Lord," gets into the kingdom of heaven, either on earth or hereafter, but religion must be counted as an asset and not a liability in this matter. It will not overcome strong hereditary tendencies, and it will not help efficaciously those who do not submit to the discipline that true religious feeling entails, and of course religion is not a panacea for the ills of mankind, though it must be counted a therapeutic adjuvant and not a nervous irritant. Professor Forster, whom one is tempted to quote because of the thoroughgoing thoughtfulness of his treatment of many of these subjects and his wise conservatism founded on that deep consideration, has discussed the question of repression of self in matters of purity as a possible source of nervous troubles of various kinds. Freudianism, as it is called, which has attracted so much attention in recent years, would seem to suggest the conclusion that a great many of the nervous symptoms of humanity are due to the repression of sex impulses. Forster has pointed out that just the opposite is true, and that there never was a time when there was so little self-repression, and also never a time when there was so much functional nervous disease. He said, "From this point of view, there can be no doubt that the modern theory of living one's nature out is largely responsible for the nervous degeneration of today, and that the widespread hysteria in modern life does not spring from those remnants of discipline and idealism which are still operative amongst us. One is compelled to ask indeed with astonishment with what right Freud finds the dangers of repression so alarming in an age which is conspicuous for self-indulgence. In reality, there has never been an age which was less influenced by the spirit of abnegation and repression than is our own. The present age is one of disintegration, in which natural instincts have largely broken away from their controlling higher ideals. If, therefore, it suffers to a peculiar degree from nervousness, one can hardly look for the cause in the fact that it constitutes a high water-mark for control and discipline. The precisely opposite conclusion would be nearer the mark. Professor Forster admits, however, that it is perfectly possible that people who have no good motive for self-repression, and who suppress instincts only out of the merest human respect and cowardice as to results, may very well suffer some of the consequences that Freud has pointed out. He says, "There is one point, however, in which one can entirely agree with Freud, or at any rate allow oneself, through him, to be led to the recognition of an important psychological and pedagogical truth. There are today certain circles who cling to the old ethical tradition only through considerations of an outward description, as the result of a species of timidity which keeps them from breaking with respectable customs, and yet these people are, at the bottom of their hearts, believers in a view of life of a totally different description, one which attaches no value or meaning to self-mastery and self-denial." Almost needless to say, this obscuration of religious motives, with the result of leaving the individual too much at the mercy of the merely physical without adequate principles for self-control, is not the fault of religion, but of its very opposite, irreligion. Forster's words are all important for the understanding of an important phase of the discussion of the cause and cure of nervous and psychic symptoms of various kinds which has attracted much more attention outside of medical circles than it deserves. The danger of the absence of religious motives in the world, because of the persuasion that new discoveries are doing away with the necessity for faith, has also been emphasized by Professor Forster, who said, "Along with the disappearance of belief in a spiritual world arises the danger that even earnest and noble men and women will be influenced in their consideration of the deeper things of life by the newest and most tangible facts alone, and will be inaccessible to all arguments going beyond the scope of mere practical sense and expediency. It would appear as if the preponderance of an intellect directed towards external things destroyed not only belief in the invisible world in a religious sense, but also undermined the power of grasping the full value and reality of certain imponderabilia in earthly life, and of understanding the deep-growing spiritual injuries which may proceed from apparently harmless and even outwardly beneficial things." End of Chapter 12. Recording by Todd.
Chapter 13 of Religion and Health. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Owlivia. Religion and Health by James Joseph Walsh. Chapter 13. Dreads. Part 1. The most fruitful source of neurotic afflictions, and especially of what have come to be termed in recent years the psychoneuroses, those disturbances of nerve function due to an unfortunate state of mind, are the dreads, or, as they have been called, the fear thoughts of mankind. Men as well as women develop, in the sense of fostering, often almost unconsciously to themselves, a dread of the interior significance of some symptom or feeling or disturbance of function, which serves to make them extremely uncomfortable. The physical sensation which they experience, and which is the basis and the source of the dread, may be only a quite normal physiological feeling common to all humanity, heightened by over-attention to it, but the fearsome state of mind will cause it to assume the significance of a definite symptom of some serious disease, or, what may be worse, an indefinite symptom of some impending affection which, in the opinion of the sufferer, may be as yet too inchoate for the physician to recognize its real significance. It is not a question of an imaginary ill, as a rule, and there is but seldom a real hallucination or creation by the fantasy out of nothing of the ailment from which these people suffer, but there is an exaggeration of some slight or at least comparatively insignificant feeling to an extent that makes it assume a serious aspect. This inhibits normal function, lessens appetite and exercise, at times even disturbs sleep, and so brings about some, at least, of the ailments that are dreaded. Not infrequently these dreads are very vague. People wake in the morning with a sense of depression and the feeling that something is hanging over them. As a result, they feel out of sorts, their appetite for breakfast is blunted, and they begin the day very badly just because of this incubus of vague disturbance of mind. Almost anything that happens during the day will emphasize their depression. As a consequence, lunch may be skipped, they do not get out as they should, and a vicious circle of influences is begun. Perhaps they eat rather heartily for dinner, and then fall asleep in their chair afterwards over the evening paper, and then find that when they go to bed they do not sleep promptly as they expected. They worry over it, feeling that there must be something the matter with them, since they cannot sleep lying down, though they could sleep so well in the chair. And if there should be a repetition of these feelings the next day, it is easy to understand how a psychoneuroses would be started, which might easily, if eating and outing and exercise were to continue to be neglected, develop into a serious condition. Many a case of nervous breakdown has a beginning as simple as this, and people of nervous temperament must be constantly on guard against it. Such patients, and they are much more common than might be thought, and they have been with us for thousands of years, for Plato describes some of them. And the oldest prescription in the world is a fumigation that was directed to curing just such a neurotic condition. They need to have faith in themselves and faith in their Maker, and to stop hesitating and doubting and thinking and dreading. I've known men, but particularly women, who had been suffering in this way, become converted so that they took up the practice of religion, which they had neglected before, and proceeded to get immensely better. Of course, there are any number of hypochondriacs among people who profess religion, but they are the exceptions which prove the rule that fewer people who have a real sense of religion and who take it seriously as a guide of life suffer from dreads and symptoms which result from them than are to be found among the people who have given up the belief and practice of their religion. This is particularly true of those who belong to the old orthodox forms of religion, which require self-denial and self-control as part of the practice of religious duties. As we've shown in the chapter on nervous diseases, the Quakers, the strict Methodists, the Roman Catholics, the Orthodox Jews get their reward for their submission to their religion, even in this world, by lessening solicitude about themselves. Indeed, there is nothing that is more likely to dispel dreads than an abiding sense of religion. If a man or a woman is convinced that there is a providence that oversees human life, as well as the universe, in whom we live and move and have our being, and whose infinite knowledge and power we can have no doubt, the unreasonableness of dreads comes home to him. The man who prays every morning, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," must have the feeling that his will be accomplished, and that is all that any of us can ask for. Somehow, that is for the best, though we may not be able to see how just now. If not a sparrow falls to the ground, but your heavenly Father knoweth, and if, as the Master said, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings, and not one of them is forgotten before God? But even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore. You are of more value than many sparrows. Surely the believer will keep himself at least from being overworried by dreads. His disposition may be such that he cannot dispose of them entirely, but at least the best source of consolation and strength is to be found in that strong faith for which there are so many strengthening expressions against the fears and dreads of life, which are to be found in the sacred writings. How many striking sentences there are in the Scriptures to help against these solicitudes! And which of you, with taking thought, can add to his stature 1 cubit? If ye then be not able to do that thing which is least, why take ye thought for the rest? How one is tempted to quote others of the expressions in that same wonderful chapter of Luke. The life is more than the meat, and the body is more than the raiment. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, which neither have storehouse nor barn, and God feedeth them. How much more are ye better than the fowls? But rather seek ye the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you a kingdom. All over the Scriptures are passages that are meant to be fear-dispelling, and that have been for many men and women in many generations. For fear is often the state of man, unless he has something to cling to. Fear not, for I am with thee. Fear ye not, nor be afraid. Have I not told thee? Fear not, I am the first and the last, for I, the Lord thy God, will hold thy right hand, saying to thee, Fear not, I will help thee. Scientists have recognized that religion and science were coordinate factors for the neutralization of the dreads that disturb humanity. Professor H.D. Seeley, who was for many years professor of geography, geology, and mineralogy at King's College London, and who was a distinguished fellow of most of the important English scientific societies, the Royal, Linnean, Geological, Zoological, and Geographical, stated in his little work, Factors in Life, his views as regards to the place of religion in dissipating the fear thoughts of life, and places it side by side with science itself in this respect. He said, "To the religious, neither life nor death has terrors, and in freeing existence from its greater anxieties, the influence of religion works on the same foundation of moral efforts as science. The sciences are the sisters of religion in that they unfold something of the laws by which the universe is governed, and by which man's life is directed. They are thus far the stepping stones of faith. And those who have learned that health is the reward which man may gain by moral discipline, that mental vigor may be augmented by the wise, or moral, use of food, and that education is a systemic exercise of moral responsibility in any or all the affairs of life, may find that in the practice and pursuit of the truths of science, they are conscious of a religious education which is a light to the feet. Such matters are factors in life which may educate us in a reverent appreciation of religious truth and divine government of the world." Many physicians of large experience have recognized the value of an abiding religious faith as a remedy for many of these dreads and doubts which so pester mankind and make so many people suffer, even from physical symptoms that seem surely to have only material causes as their basis, because they so hamper the will to live. Sir Dyce Duckworth, the distinguished English physician, once wrote to a friend, "What is always needed is a reverent study and a full acknowledgement of God as a Father and as the great all in all. In my experience, the only solution of all our difficulties is to maintain a humble, childlike faith and a confident trust in the perfect love of God, who knows whereof we are made and remembers that we are but dust. With that and perfect love, there need be no fear, and all will come right in his own time. That is the faith to live by and to die with, and the happiest people, and the happiest of the dying, are those who hold firm by that faith. This is my experience after much thought, much knowledge of human nature, and not a little study of all the difficulties you relate to me. But it must not be thought that these dreads cause only the trivial instances of nervous breakdown in which people never very capable give way before the strenuous call of commercial life in the large cities of our time, nor must it be thought that education is dispelling them. Some idea of the important role that dreads may play in the production of human ills that seem to be very serious and that often prove quite incapacitating for mental and physical work, even in men of fine abilities and proven powers, may be gathered from what happened during the recent Great War. The Allied nations had to maintain some 50,000 beds behind the lines for the accommodation of patients suffering from functional nervous affections really founded on dreads. At the beginning, these cases were misunderstood, and they were unfortunately called shell shock because they seemed so serious that it was thought that they were due to some concussion of the nervous system, that is, some shaking up of its elements that made it impossible for it to function normally, even though there were no external signs of injury. After a time, however, it came to be appreciated that the great majority of these patients were suffering from major hysteria due to loss of control over the nervous system as a consequence of the most inevitable dreads which developed in the awful conditions of warfare in the trenches, with its terrifying sights and sounds, and with the intense strain put upon the nervous system because of the demands made upon the physical energy almost to the point of exhaustion. After loss of sleep and irregular eating, wet feet for days at a time, exposure to the inclemencies of the weather, and then having to withstand an enemy attack, often at dawn after a fearsome barrage had been laid down on them for hours, it is no wonder that in many cases men's nervous control did give way. They were not cowards, they were not malingerers. On the contrary, they were often brave men who had volunteered for the service, giving up important positions at home to take up the defense of their country. And yet, after a time, their dreads dominated them, and they suffered from all sorts of symptoms. Some of them could not see. A number could not hear. Some could not use their legs, and some could not employ their arms properly. Some walked with a limp. Some had tremor that made their usefulness as soldiers absolutely at an end. Nearly all of them had a series of complaints which they wanted to detail in all their minuteness to every physician who came near. Their stories of what had happened were mainly untrue or utter exaggerations of the actual events. And yet these men were not liars, and they were not the doddering idiots that they sometimes seemed to be. They were just fellow mortals who meant to do their best and who had been affected in this way because they were asked to stand what was beyond their strength of soul to withstand. The educated suffered more than the uneducated. There were 4 times as many shell-shock cases among the officers of the British Army in proportion to their number as there were among the privates. Neither ambition, nor nobility, nor any artificial distinction of any kind seemed to make any difference, for all classes and conditions of men came down with it. Its frequence can be well judged from the fact that 1/3 of all the dismissions from the British Army, not counting the wounded, was for shell-shock, which of course should be called by its proper name of major hysteria. 1/7 of all the dismissions, if the wounded were included, was for this reason. It had been the custom to think, before the war, that only a comparatively few men, mostly those of a certain feministic appearance and delicacy of constitution, were likely to suffer from hysteria. It was found, however, that college graduates who stood at the head of their classes, athletes who held records, broad-shouldered, healthy men who had been considered to be the very acme of common sense, men who were supposed to be without a nerve in their makeup, all these proved to have nerves, and when the war got on their nerves, they suffered from the complaints which we have mentioned, and many others, including pains and discomforts of all kinds, and inabilities and incapacities, motor and sensory, as well as of the memory, of the mind, or the will. This recent significant experience will give some idea of how potent dreads may be in the production of symptoms which seem surely to be due to physical rather than merely mental conditions. Most people would probably be inclined to think that insofar as dreads produce diseases by the exaggeration of minor symptoms, at most scarcely more than mental conditions of discomfort would result from them. What are called the psychoneuroses, that is, the neurotic affections dependent on the state of mind, may simulate almost any of the organic conditions, and may seem to be serious diseases. Through the creation of unfortunate habits, they may give rise to a great many rather severe physical symptoms. The war neuroses emphasize this for us. Inability to use limbs, either legs or arms, is quite common in connection with them. Disturbances of sensation, such as defective hearing and eyesight, or even what seems to be complete blindness and deafness, may develop. Tremors are quite common, and pains and aches in connection with the disabilities of the limbs are extremely frequent. End of Chapter 13, Part 1. Chapter 13, Part 2 of Religion and Health. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Owlivia. Religion and Health by James Joseph Walsh. Chapter 13, Dreads, Part 2. A very usual experience is to find that the patient has, as a preliminary, suffered some injury. This may not be severe, but it is enough to cause the sufferer to spare the limb that is affected. And unfortunately, physicians sometimes put a limb with a minor affection in plaster of Paris or in a splint for some time. The patient's own solicitude with regard to the hurt may cause almost as effective a splinting of it as a plaster cast or wooden slat and a bandage. Whenever this happens, the unused muscles lose some of their nutrition. This is partly due to the fact that the circulation is interfered with, because the active contraction of muscles, especially of the legs, is depended on by nature to help the venous or return circulation by bringing about compression of the veins. The valves in the veins are so arranged that when the veins are compressed and the blood thus pressed out of them, it cannot move away from the heart, but is impelled onward toward the heart. Besides, the sending down of nervous impulses for the active use of muscles increases the size of the arteries to the part by direct action on their walls, and whenever there is failure to send impulses down, the arteries do not carry as much blood as usual, and the nutrition of that part suffers as a result. If this inactive state of the muscles continues for a few days, they will become somewhat flaccid, and after a week or more will actually begin to decrease in size. As a consequence of this, They cannot be used to as good advantage as before, and use of them sets up an achy condition as soon as the limb is set free for use, whether it has been splinted by the physician or by the patient's mind. If the patient is still solicitous, he notices this condition of pain and concludes that it means that the muscles are not yet in condition of health where they should be used, and he puts on the splints, metaphorical or literal, once more. The muscles grow more flaccid and eventually atrophic as a consequence, until sometimes there will be a difference of more than an inch in the girth of the two limbs at some point, and this atrophy may proceed much farther. It seems almost impossible to believe that men and women could thus make a limb useless, but this is actually what happens rather frequently. The effects of the original injury will pass off in a few days, but the effects of the disuse of the limb may remain for months or even years because of the disturbance of circulation and of nerve impulse. It is probable that the nerves themselves have a trophic or nutritional, that is, vitalizing, influence on the muscles. Some physiologists actually talk of there being trophic fibers in the nerves, though it would seem more reasonable to think that the nerve trophic effect comes from the modification of the circulation to that part. Whenever muscles have to be increased in size or won back from an atrophic condition, the individual to whom they belong must go through a period of soreness and tenderness in those muscles, which is often very hard to bear. The young fellow who, after a rather relaxed summer, begins training for the football team in the fall, knows how sore and tender his muscles have become. After the first day or two of training, each time he wakes up at night, he turns over in bed with the feeling that every bit of him is full of tenderness. Any number of people under similar circumstances are inclined to think that they must have caught cold. They usually reason thus: I got into a perspiration and sat down for a while and then took cold, and that is the reason for all this painful condition that has developed. That word cold is as unfortunate as shell shock. There is no such thing as taking cold. We catch infections, but much more frequently in fall and spring than in the winter. The young man who is in training usually pays no attention to such unfavorable suggestions or dreads, since he knows that he must take his medicine of further hard exercise until he has hardened and developed his muscles. And then, instead of their causing discomfort, nothing in the world gives him so much satisfaction as their active exercise. Older people, however, and especially those who have what may be called a dready disposition, do not call their muscle discomfort soreness and tenderness. They speak of pains and aches. The very words carry suggestion of evil with them, and above all, they carry with them an inhibitory suggestion which keeps muscles from being used normally. If, then, certain older people get an injury, even though it may not be very serious, so long as it causes them to give up the use of a limb for a while, or sets them to using the muscles of it a little differently from before, a psychoneurosis on the basis of a dread, but with the physical basis of somewhat atrophied muscles to keep it up, may develop and persist for weeks and months and even years. As a consequence of this state, much more of the mind than the body, men may walk lame or be very awkward in the use of one arm, or they may have a little stoop, or they may dread very much the using of some group of muscles. Such conditions usually occur in the neck or in various parts of the back, and especially in the lumbar region, with strikingly visible effects. It might seem impossible that such conditions should develop and persist for any length of time in sensible and above all intelligent people, and yet I suppose that every physician's casebook contains a number of examples. After he has been in practice for 10 years or more, this will surely be true if he has had much to do with nervous patients. One of the most distinguished scientists that we had in this country, possessed of one of the finest intellects of our generation, thoroughly sensible and noted for his executive ability, suffered from a slight attack of sciatica, to which he had been predisposed by some unusual work in connection with a heavy fall of snow, when he had to go out and do the shoveling himself, since labor was not available. He never quite got over it. For some time he carried 2 crutches because he had so little confidence in putting down the foot on that side, after having spared it for a while. Then, for several years, he carried a single crutch. In the meantime, he was examined by 6 of the best physicians in the country, who could find nothing the matter with him except that disuse had rendered the muscles of that leg slightly atrophic, and he would have to push through a period of soreness and tenderness while exercising them. He carried a cane ever afterwards, walked a little lame, and favored that leg. Persistent sciaticas of this kind and lumbagos are much more common than they are thought. It was a case of this kind, undoubtedly, that brought about Bernheim's interest in hypnotism at Nancy and initiated that wave of attention to hypnotism at the end of the 19th century, which did so much harm. A patient who had suffered from sciatica for some years and walked a little lame as a consequence came under Bernheim's care, and he tried without success every therapeutic resource at his command to make him better. Finally, his patient gave up calling on him, completely discouraged. He had gone to a great many physicians before Bernheim, and all of them had failed to do him any effectual good. They could relieve his discomfort for a while, but when he stopped taking drugs, that returned, and his limb could be used no better than before. Some months after Bernheim missed the patient from his clinic, he met him on the street one day, walking perfectly straight without his cane and evidently entirely well. He was so much interested that he stopped to ask what had cured him. The patient told him that he had gone around to Thibault, who, almost alone in Europe, was still practicing hypnotism, for the practice had been greatly discredited by certain exposures in England shortly after the middle of the century. Bernheim, who had ignored Leibold's work before, now took an interest in it and found, of course, that hypnotism, or indeed, though Bernheim did not know that, anything else would give these patients the confidence to push through a period of tenderness and soreness in regaining the use of their muscles, would cure them. The incident began that period of reawakened interest in hypnotism, which now constitutes such a ludicrous series of events in the medicine of the end of the 19th century. Such cases are by no means so uncommon as they might be thought. I have known the teacher of a high school to slip while coming out of school, fall on his knee, bruise it rather badly, and then have this bruised condition heal very well, only to develop in the course of a few weeks a distinct inability to use the muscles of that leg properly, until he had to walk with a marked limp. The circumference of the limb above the knee reduced distinctly in size. It suffered more from cold than did the other one. It perspired more freely. It was distinctly more sensitive to the touch, and it would seem as though there must be some serious underlying nervous condition. He passed through the hands of several specialists, including one who wanted to remove a cartilage in the knee joint which he said had been dislocated, and another who insisted that he was suffering from a neuritis of a branch of the sciatic nerve, and who wanted to inject water beneath the sheath of it, or at least lay it bare and stretch it. Fortunately, we persuaded him to join an athletic club and take more exercise than usual, and above all, exercise that limb. He had massage and passive movements for it, but these are of very little service in these cases, because the nervous impulses must come down from above. It would almost seem as though the will sent down some of its own creative energy through the nerves which lead to that part. He is now entirely well, though he suffered for several years, and absolutely nothing was done for him except to make him eat better and make him push through a period of soreness and tenderness. He used to call them pains and aches before we explained the condition to him, until he had properly recovered the use of his limb. On the other hand, I have known a good clergyman with a rather similar condition to this, who had bumped his shin bone not far below the knee, and after recovery from that had developed a marked psychoneurosis in the muscles above the knee, refused to be cured by any such simple procedure as merely exercising himself back to health. He could not bring himself to think that it was only his own lack of willpower that had caused the condition to develop. Above all, he needed something external to cure him. He finally went to a bone setter, one of those old fellows who claimed to be the seventh son of a seventh son or something of that kind, possessed of marvelous hereditary power and instinctive intuition in the matter of setting bones right, and who cure nearly everything under the sun and a few other things besides by their supposed bone-setting processes. My clerical friend was sure that he had been cured by the bone setter, but any physician would have told him that what had happened was that his faith in his healer had released his inhibition of his muscles and given him the confidence to go on and use them as they should be used. That is, of course, as far as he possibly could at first. Then they were gradually restored to their former condition of health and strength. That is what happened, and he has had no recurrence. He is quite sure, however, that the trouble was a subluxation of his hip joint, which the bone setter set right, thus allowing nervous impulses and the blood to flow properly through that part once more. His own will was the only obstacle, and it was that alone that had to be overcome and used as a therapeutic agent. These patients are the stock and trade of all sorts of irregular practitioners. Whenever they think anything is the matter with them, they must be cured. They never get better of themselves. They need something or somebody to which to pin their faith. It is the hardest thing in the world to find out what is the matter with a man who has nothing the matter with him except a state of mind and its consequences in his physical condition. He must have his state of mind changed first of all, and usually he requires some rather strong suggestion for that purpose. What is likely to affect him most favorably is some novel or unusual method of treatment, or some new discovery in science recently applied to medicine, or some new method of healing, or some supposedly new invention or discovery in therapeutics. These patients are a veritable nuisance in medicine. It is the cures of them, made by all sorts of newfangled remedies, which make it so difficult for physicians to judge whether a new remedy has a positive favorable physical effect or only a mental influence. Very probably, the best application of the place of dreads in life and how much of good is accomplished by their neutralization can be obtained from the number of sufferers of all kinds who are cured by all sorts of new remedies which prove after a time to have no physical effect at all. We have discussed this subject of the remedies that have come and gone in medicine in the volume Psychotherapy. It has been very well said that the most important chapter in the history of medicine is that of the cures that have failed. It illustrates very thoroughly how much influence the mind has over the body, and particularly how much dreads have meant for the production of symptoms which have been relieved whenever the patient had his dreads lifted, no matter what might be the agent to accomplish this purpose. Instead of decreasing, dreads have increased, just in proportion as popular education has spread, and more people have been able to read and receive unfavorable suggestions of all kinds. This has been particularly true with the diminution of the influence of religion over people's minds. All sorts of religious substitutes, which would give people enough confidence in themselves to enable them to throw off their dreads, have gained vogue and have come to be very popular institutions in recent years. Dowie, who claimed he was Elijah returned to earth, and Schlatter, who said he was divinely inspired to cure people, were as successful in the 20th century as Great Raikes, the Stroker, who said that the Holy Ghost appeared to him in a dream and told him to heal people in the 17th. Metaphysical healing of all kinds has been successful, and spiritualistic healing and new thought and magnetic healing, with as little magnetism about it as Mesmer's famous battery, which had no electricity, all these have cured people. All sorts of healers are successful just because they lift the dreads and make people forget the inhibitions that they have been exercising over their functions. Indeed, this state of fear thought is one of the most prolific sources of symptoms, or rather, let us say of complaints, that medicine has to do with at all times. Hence the importance of the chapter of the cures that have failed. Almost any religious feeling will be helpful in the matter, but an abiding sense of rational religion will save many people from being imposed on by all sorts of upstart theories and religious systems which base their claim to recognition on these cures of human beings. These patients furnish a great many of the cures made at shrines. That is why at every shrine there are so many crutches and canes and braces and belts and splints and supports of various kinds to be seen. They have been left there by grateful patients who were able to drop them as a result of the change of mind that came over them during their devotions. Many cures besides these occur at shrines, and I have taken a good deal of pains to assure myself that most of the affections that are healed at them are quite different from these psychoneuroses. Over 60% of the cures made at Lourdes, for instance, are of tuberculosis processes. Many of these are of external visible lesions. Some of them, after years of progress in spite of all sorts of treatment, heal over the course of 24 hours. I have seen this happen to a lupus at Lourdes during my stay there, and I do not know how to explain that incident by any natural process. To me, it seemed surely supernatural. I know that there are some physicians who suggest that we do not know all the possibilities of the therapeutic effect of the mind on the body, and somehow there may be included in the psychotherapeutic armamentarium the power to heal tissues rapidly, even when they have been the subject of a chronic granulomatous process for years. But I cannot but think that is merely an effort to retain what seems to me plainly miraculous within the domain of the natural. I know, too, that Dr. Boisseret's experience, so carefully noted and written out in his clinic at Lourdes, shows that there are cases of real joint trouble which have been cured with similar rapidity, but these are very rare. Most of the halt and crippled who are cured at shrines have simply been the victims of an attitude of mind which has affected their muscles and their use of certain joints unfavorably, so that they had to carry crutches or canes or wear braces. The deep influence of religion will cure them very often, but it is not a miracle in any supernatural sense of the word, though it is a wonderful event, and that is all that miracle means by etymology. Indeed, professors of neurology have occasionally foretold that certain of these patients would perhaps be cured at shrines, and their prophecies in specific instances have been fulfilled. The cures are examples of what faith can do in lifting a dread, but that faith may be exercised with regard to much less worthy objects that are presented at shrines and yet work successfully. When George Cohen, in The Miracle Man, had the cure that attracted the attention to the New Prophet occur with regard to a lame boy, he was eminently wise in the selection of just the type of case that could very readily be cured that way, and yet the fact that the boy had been lame for years and now walked perfectly made the healer seem a veritable wonder-worker. Dreads have always been with mankind, and their effects upon human bodies have been the stock and trade of the medicine man in the primitive tribes and among savages, and of his successors in suggestive medicine among educated and even cultivated people down to our own time. They can be conjured away by almost any impression that is deep enough to produce a favorable suggestion. Religion of all kinds has been appealed to successfully to neutralize them. The one rational cure for them is a deep sense of confidence in the Almighty and in an overruling providence which serves to dissipate the phobic state of mind with its inevitable inhibitions on bodily functions. It may be necessary for its successful working that the correction of many minor physical ills should be secured, but the all-important basis of successful treatment for the psychoneuroses and the many ailments of mankind which are complicated by psychic states is a thoroughgoing belief that God is in his heaven and all is well with the world, even though there may be difficulties to be overcome, hardships to be borne, and many things that are far from easy to understand. End of chapter 13. Recording by Owlivia.
Chapter 14 of Religion and Health. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Religion and Health by James Joseph Walsh. Chapter 14, Suffering. The problem of the meaning of suffering and evil in the world is the greatest natural mystery that man has to face. It has raised the question as to whether life is worth living or not in some minds. It causes a great many people to be disturbed about the meaning of life, and has led some sensitive people to conclude that there cannot be an overseeing, all-wise providence, since otherwise he would surely prevent all the needless suffering there is in the world. Biologists, owing to their occupation with the thought of the struggle for existence in current theories of evolution, have been particularly inclined to say that they could not think that there was a providence, because there was so much of carnage in nature, so much ruthless destruction of life amid suffering, for which it would be hard to find any satisfactory reason. There has been no little exaggeration in this view, for a calm review of conditions as they obtain in nature shows not so much of active contest as a healthy competition for the means of existence, in the midst of which death comes to the weakling without anything like the suffering so much emphasized. It must not be forgotten that the supersensitiveness of the sedentary student must be taken into account in the appreciation of the significance of such a declaration. For the recluse scientist often shrinks from trials that the active outdoors man finds only a stimulus to action, which serve to develop powers and give satisfaction rather than any real suffering. The incentive to have life and to have it more abundantly, which this affords to the hardier natures, makes the poet's expression, forsan et haec olam meminisse juvabit, perhaps we shall be glad to recall these hardships in the time to come. Easy to appreciate. Life without suffering would lack the contrast which saves it from the dull monotony that might tempt to waste of energy and dissipation. Perhaps the most and best illustration of the actual benefit to man which accrues from suffering is to be found in the fact that one of the surprising results of the presence of the mystery of suffering in the world is that meditation over it has given rise to the 5 greatest dramatic poems that were ever written. Men contemplating it have been led to the expression of the deepest thoughts that have ever stirred minds. These great poems have come at longer and shorter intervals during 4,000 years. From Job, the essential ideas for which probably date from around 1800 BC, through its literary form is much later. Through Achilles' Prometheus, Shakespeare's Hamlet, Calderon's The Wonder-Working Magician, down to Goethe's Faust. Of these 5 dramatizations of the mystery of human suffering, recurring poetic impersonation of Hamlet's, the time is out of joint, O cursed spite, the ever I was born to set it right. The greatest, as conceded by all the critics, is not, as might be expected from the very prevalent impression that man makes wonderful progress down the ages, the last one goes fast, but is the first one, Job. No one has ever expressed so well the only reasonable attitude of mind that man must take in the presence of evil and suffering as this man of the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and who was simple and upright in fearing God and avoiding evil, yet who had to bear some of the severest trials that man has ever been called upon to undergo. Mr. H.G. Wells has recently, in one of his thought-stimulating novels, shown us that verisimilitude of the most modern type could be woven into a story which followed the outlines of the book of Job very closely, so that far from being dead, even the novelty-seeking fiction readers of our generation have brought home to them the fact that Job is still a very living piece of literature. Job's answer to the mystery of evil is that man must confess his inability to understand it, but he can trust the God who thunders wonderfully with his voice, and doeth great and unsearchable things, who commandeth the snow to go down on the earth and the winter rain, who knoweth what ways the light spreads, and heat divideth on the earth, who joins together the shining stars, the Pleiades, and can stop the turning about of Arcturus, and who created Behemoth and Leviathan, and can bind the rhinoceros, and has fashioned the ostrich. All that Job can say is, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Therefore, for any impatience that he may have displayed over his suffering, he reprehends himself, and promises to do penance in dust and ashes. And after this Job lived 140 years, and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. So Job died, being old and full of days. In any consideration of suffering, above all in connection with the related subjects of health and religion, we must not forget that suffering has always been a badge of the race, the common lot of men, so that this very community of it greatly reduces human reaction towards it, since the sufferer cannot help but note that everyone else must submit to it as well as himself. At times among those who fail to think deeply, enough this may be doubted. The poor may even envy the rich, because they suppose that they must, by their riches, escape suffering. But most physicians soon learn to appreciate very well that the mental discomforts of the wealthy, their disappointed social ambitions, their thwarted aspirations after greater wealth, their envy of their more successful neighbors, but above all their frequent disappointment in their children, though it is almost invariable their very wealthy has spoiled the children and brought their greatest griefs on them, are really the source of much more genuine suffering than the poor have to bear. The worries of life increase with possessions, not decrease, as is fondly hoped, And as the author of The Romance of the Rose said some 7 centuries ago, "And he who what he holds esteems, enough is rich beyond the dreams Of many a dreary usurer, and lives his life days happier far, for naught it signifies what gains the wretched usurer makes the pains Of poverty afflict him yet, who having sluggeth still to get." Suffering must ever remain a mystery, especially when we take into account the fact that all of us are profoundly possessed by the desire for happiness. We can never probe to the bottom of the mystery and know all its meaning, but at least we can readily understand that in the vast majority of cases, instead of being an evil, it is a good. Nothing so deepens and develops character as suffering. Take the case of our young men who went to war, so many of them scarcely more than boys, feeling but little of the responsibilities of life, and see how they come back to us matured by the hardships and suffering through which they had to go. Thucydides said nearly 2,500 years ago, "There is very little difference among men, only a few of them rise above the great mass because they have gone through hard things when they were young." It would seem as though we have changed all that, for we are deeply intent on making things just as easy as possible for the young. But a generation ago, Gladstone repeated Thucydides' expression with heartiest approval, and 20 years ago, John Morley, writing the life of Gladstone, agreed with both of them. I wonder if there are 2 men in our time who have known better than Gladstone and Morley. In that sense, suffering is no mystery, and it is easy to see how it is quite literally true that whom the Lord loves, he chastises. It is the chastisement of suffering that brings out the powers of men. Anyone who has not had to suffer in life is nearly always a self-centered egoist without sympathy, but above all, without that fellow feeling that comes only from having gone through similar experience. He who has not suffered has really lived below the surface of his being at all, and he does not know himself. To know thyself is the most important thing in the world and the only way to know others. The men who have done great thinking for us have nearly always been men who have had to suffer much. It was a blind Milton who wrote Paradise Lost. When Camoens wrote the German and French critics think, and when Germans and French agree about anything, there is probably a deep underlying truth in it. The greatest epic in modern times. He was starving in a garret, and his old Indian servant was begging him on the streets to secure enough to keep body and soul together until the great work was finished. Cervantes wrote what Lord Macaulay called incomparably the greatest novel ever written, in a debtor's prison, out of which it seemed he might never be able to secure his release. Dante wrote what many think the greatest poem ever written, during a long exile in which he learned how bitter it is to eat the bread of others' tables. Poeta laudator alicet. The poet is praised and starves. It is true in our time as when Horace said it 3,000 years ago. Goldwin Smith has brought out very clearly the fact that suffering and evil are really a necessity in a world, if this is the place of trial, as everyone believes, for of course such a belief represents the only satisfactory explanation of life as we have it. Man must have something to strive for and against if there are to be stepping stones of our dead selves to higher things. And so it is not surprising that Dr. Goldwin Smith should have said, "At the same time, so far as we can discern, character can be formed only by an effort which implies something against which to strive, so that without evil, or what appears to us evil, character could not be formed. The existence of evil, in fact, so far as we can see, is the necessary condition of active life. Suffering has been with us from the beginning, and it will always be with us. Instead of an evil, it is one of God's great gifts to man, and yet it sometimes makes little souls bitter and swamps the efforts of those who cannot rise above its trials. Religion is the one element that is supremely helpful in this. Above all, in the terminal sufferings of mankind, when there is no longer any question of pain that has to be borne in developing character for this life, the only consolation is that to be derived from religion and a firm belief in hereafter, and an acknowledgement of the fact that somehow God knows best, and all is for the best. Without this, the awful suffering from cancer, which is increasing rather than diminishing, and which seems so rooted in human nature that we shall probably never solve its mystery, or at least be able to secure human nature against it, as well as ever so many other chronic sources of pain that will never cease entirely until the end of life comes, becomes hideous specters for humanity, and suffering has very little meaning. No matter what our attitude of mind may be with regard to suffering, there is no question that we have to stand it under present conditions in this little world of ours. During the next 12 months, scarcely less than 100,000 people will die of cancer in the country, and 1.5 million victims of the disease will breathe their last throughout the world. When we add up all the accidents in industry and transportation, all the wounds in war and civil life, and add the affections which in one way or another cause mechanical stoppages of processes in the body, for these are the exquisitely painful conditions, it is easy to understand that we need consolation for suffering. An old medical axiom is that the doctor can seldom cure, but he can often relieve, and he can always console. There are many good physicians, however, who feel their ability to console sadly hampered by the fact that so many men and women in our time do not believe in a hereafter, for which their sufferings in this world can be a preparation, and that therefore the terminal suffering of existence, of which there is and manifestly always will be such an amount, can mean nothing for them except just so much pain that has to be borne without any good reason that they can see, except that somehow or other things were so arranged in this world that there is ever so much more of pain and suffering than of joy in it. 2,000 years ago, Cicero said, in his own oratorical way, that it was better for all of us to believe in immortality. For if there was no immortality, we should never live after death to know it, which comes very near being an Irish bull by anticipation. While if there was, and we had not believed in it, there would come a very rude awakening to the truth of things. Something of the same problem has been put in much more flippant and yet very expressive way in modern slang. If there is no other world than this, then someone handed us an awful lemon, where we were sent into existence. That is, I suppose, one answer to the mystery of suffering, so sure to come to all men in some way or another, and it is one that counsels us to seek the only real consolation for suffering, that which is to be found in religious feeling that somehow or another, somewhere, there is someone who knows and understands, and suffering has its meaning. God in his heaven, and all's well with the world, in spite of the fact that nature red in tooth and claw works such sad havoc with her creatures. What the belief in immortality and the feeling that this life is merely in portico has accomplished in giving a man equanimity in the face of disappointments and patient fortitude under even atrocious pain is very well illustrated by what Professor William James had to say of Thomas Davidson in his essay on him. Davidson died of cancer at a comparatively early age, considering the length of time that many scholars enjoy, and for many years he had prepared a large amount of material for that history of the interaction of the Greek, Christian Hebrew, and Arabic throughout one on one, another before the arrival of learning, which was to be his magnum opus. Davidson was destined never to finish his work. Professor James, who had been an intimate friend, and who was so close to him in the organization of the Glenmore School of Culture Sciences on Hurricane Mountain, at the head of Keene Valley in the Adirondacks, had felt the possibility of this accident of destiny, and had inquired of Davidson with regard to his great prospective work. Knowing how short his life may be, I once asked him whether he felt no concern lest the work already done by him should be frustrate from the lack of necessary compliment in case he were suddenly cut off. His answer surprised me by its indifference. He would work as long as he lived, he said, but not allow himself to worry, and would look serenely at whatever might be the outcome. This seemed to me uncommonly high-minded. I think that Davidson's conviction of immortality had much to do with such a superiority to the accidents. On the surface and toward small things, he was irritable enough, but the undertone of his character was remarkable for equanimity. He showed in it his final illness, of which his misery was really atrocious. There were no general complaints of lamentations about the personal situation or the arrest to his career. It was the human lot, and he must even bear it, so he kept his mind upon objective matter. Only a profound conviction of personal immortality will enable a man who feels that he is cut off in the midst of his work to bear with patience the final ailment which by its very progress is precluding the possibility of accomplishing the task he had set to himself. Yet this interruption of their chosen labor inevitably comes to a great many men, for death, no matter how late it might seem to onlookers to occur, happens untimely to most of humanity, even though they may count up years far beyond the 70 of the psalmist. The great resource in the midst of the suffering caused by the war for soldiers and civilians has been religion. It was sadly needed, but it was magnificently employed. Anyone who saw how much their religion meant to the soldiers, who really had faith, will appreciate very well how valuable it was for them. Many a man who had given up his faith, and this was particularly true of the French, found a new power to dare and to do, and also to bear and to carry on, in the religion that it seemed they could so readily dispense with before. Colton, writing a series of aphorisms in Lacan a century ago, declared that there are 3 arguments for atheism more effective than any other: health and wealth and friends. When we have our health and an abundance of money at our command, besides many and powerful friends who seem willing to do everything that they can for us, we feel but little need of God, and then many men refuse to believe in him. Necessity is a very precious thing, the mother not only of invention, but of reverence and many other good qualities. But when suffering comes, especially if wealth, and in that case of course friends, have disappeared, God is very firm support to lean on. Many a man has found his faith again under such circumstances, and has realized how flimsy were the veils which he had allowed to come between him and his recognition of his obligations to his Creator. The presence of suffering and evil in the world has provided us one of the most striking arguments for the existence of God, and of a hereafter that we have. As Goldwin Smith said, "This is all events is certain. If death is to end all alike for the righteous and for the unrighteous, for those who have been blessings and for those who have been curses to their kind, the power which rules the universe cannot be just in any sense of the word which we can understand." Dr. Carroll, in The Mastery of Nervousness, has summed up the value of suffering as a revealer of power and a bracer of strength in the words that are more worth remembering. None knows his real strength till he has faced failure and tasted the bitterness of defeat. Physical and mental suffering and soul pain come to all that endurance may be developed, for without this strength which conquers can never be. The master's man laughs in the face of personal hurts. Offenses fail to offend, insults fail to embitter. He turns with shame from the so-called depths of suffering. For him, honor and majesty of the soul are found upon the heights of suffering. In a world, the really brave man does not let himself sink under the burden of suffering, but maintains his place and stands up firmly under it. Under these circumstances, suffering, instead of being an evil, is a good. After the showing of mercy, man is likest to God when he stands suffering bravely and brings good out of evil, even as providence does. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Religion and Health. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Religion and Health by James Joseph Walsh. Chapter 15. Pain. Pain is one of the very hard things of life, which most people find it extremely difficult to bear with equanimity. I suppose that the majority of human beings, especially when they are young, do not feel nearly so much dread of death as they do of the possibility of years of discomfort preceding it, or even a short period of very acute pain when nature is preparing for dissolution. Older folks learn to bear physical pain better and come to appreciate how much harder to stand is mental anguish. Modern life, with its cultivation of comforts and conveniences and the elimination of discomforts of all kinds, has greatly fostered the dread of pain. We hear much of the progress of humanity founded on the increase of comfort, but that way lies degeneracy and failure to take life seriously. Human character develops under the stress of pain, and even the body acquires self-control through it, and is trained under the discipline of pain not to react so disturbingly as is the case when there has been no experience with it, or but very little. We find it almost impossible to understand, now that we have cultivated the comforts of life so sedulously, how men and women stood the discomforts to which they were subjected in the ordinary run of life practically every day 2 generations ago. A great many of them slept in little stuffy attics with scarcely any chance for the free movement of air on the hot days of summer, often immediately underneath a roof which had been exposed to the direct rays of the sun all day long. In the winter, not infrequently, they broke the ice in their pitchers to secure water for washing. Their heating arrangements were so imperfect that in the colder months, at least there was very little possibility of comfort. A great fire makes a very charming ornamental addition to a room which is heated by steam or some other modern heating arrangement, but when it is the only means of heating, it is not very efficacious except in milder weather. On very cold days, an open fire will heat one side of the individual, but not the whole person, and at best the feet are likely to be cold, because the open fire must be fed with an abundance of air, and the draught runs along the floor in order to get to it. The story is told of an English public school in the old days where the headmaster met one of the smaller boys crying because of the cold. On being told what was the matter, the headmaster simply remarked that this was no young ladies' seminary, and young gentlemen are expected to stand things without tears. 20 years later in India, during the mutiny, just before that boy who had cried from the cold led a forlorn hope of a charge with the idea of saving the lives of women and children, he remarked to his commanding officer, who was himself also from that same public school, "This is what old," naming the headmaster, "would have said is no young ladies' seminary," and then he went out without more ado to accept death in a great cause. It is extremely difficult for us to understand how the people of the older time, young and old, endured all these trials and hardships, though it is not difficult to comprehend that if one were exercised daily in standing things of this kind, it would be much easier to bear pain and even serious discomfort than it is at the present time, when many people can bear only the touch of silk on the skin, and the Sybarite's complaint of his utter inability to sleep because there was a crushed rose leaf underneath him has become almost a literal reality. More and more we are eliminating discomforts from life and making things as comfortable and easy as possible. From the carefully tempered water of the morning bath to the warm foot bath just before sleep, in a bedroom where the temperature makes it possible to undress for bed without a shiver, all is arranged for the avoidance of the slightest discomfort. Pain has become a veritable nightmare to most people as a consequence of the lack of the necessity to stand things in life, and it is therefore all the more interesting to see what an effect religion can have in enabling people to stand pain. In my volume, Health Through Willpower, I have told the story of the second last general of the Jesuits, and the very serious and intensely painful operation which he insisted on standing without an anesthetic. The story is worth repeating here as showing what a habit of prayer and practice of self-control can do for a man in the face of some of the severest pain a human being is asked to stand. Generals of the Jesuits have usually found their way into literature for very different reasons from this. He had developed a sarcoma of his upper arm and was advised to submit to an amputation at the shoulder joint. As he was well on in the 60s, the operation presented an extremely serious problem. The surgeons suggested that he should be ready for the anesthetic at a given hour the next morning, and then they would proceed to operate. He replied that he would be ready for the operation at the time appointed, but that he would not take an anesthetic. They argued with him that it would be quite impossible for him to stand unanesthetized the elaborate cutting and dissection necessary to complete an operation of this kind in a most important part of the body, where large nerves and arteries would have to be cut through and where the slightest disturbance on the part of the patient might easily lead to serious or even fatal results. Above all, he could not hope to stand the exaggerated pain that would surely be produced in the tissues rendered more sensitive than normal by the increased circulation to the part due to the growth of the tumor. He insisted, however, that he would not take an anesthetic, for surely here seemed a chance to welcome suffering voluntarily, as his Lord and Master had done. I believe that the head surgeon said at first that he would not operate. He felt sure that the operation would have to be interrupted after it had begun, because the patient would not be able to stand the pain, and there would then be the danger from bleeding, as well as from infection which might occur as the result of the delay. The general of the Jesuits, however, was so calm and firm that at last it was determined to permit him at least to try to stand it. The event was most interesting. The patient not only underwent the operation without a murmur, but absolutely without wincing. The surgeon who performed the operation said afterwards, "It was like cutting wax and not human flesh, so far as any reaction was concerned, though of course it bled very freely." Professor William James has noted this same power with regard to that most painful of all diseases in which pain seems so much harder to stand because it is hopeless, and there is no possibility that the endurance of it can lead eventually to any improvement. The patient must just stand being racked to pieces until the end comes. No wonder, then, that the professor of psychology should note with commendation the effect of religion in bringing about a sense of well-being, in spite of the constantly progressive physical condition which was so painfully eating life away. He said, "The most genuinely saintly person I have ever known is a friend of mine now suffering from cancer of the breast. I hope that she may pardon my citing her here as an example of what ideas can do. Her ideas have kept her a practically well woman for months after she should have given up and gone to bed. They have annulled all pain and weakness and given her a cheerful, active life, unusually beneficent to others to whom she has afforded help. Her doctors, acquiescing in results they could not understand, have had the good sense to let her go her own way." Many physicians, I am sure, have had the opportunity to witness instances very like that which is thus recorded with wholehearted sympathy by Professor James. I count it as one of the precious privileges of life to have known rather well a distinguished professor of anatomy at Professor James's own university. He suffered from incurable cancer, and 2 years before the end knew that nothing could be done for him, and that it was just a question of time and pain and the most poignant discomfort until the end would come. He continued his lessons at the university. He finished up a book that he had long wished to write and had begun several times. He maintained his simple social relations with friends in such a gracious spirit that none of them suspected his condition, and continued until the very end bravely to go on with his work, quite as if there was nothing the matter. I shall never forget how shocked I was when I once presumed to invite an addition to his labors by asking him to make a public address, and he told me, as a brother physician, just how much he had to be in the trained nurse's hands every day so as to keep himself from being offensive to others. I had met him at lunch in the bosom of his family and spent several pleasant hours with him afterward without ever a thought of the possibility of the hideous malignant neoplasm which was constantly at work making a wreck of his tissues, and which no one knew better than he would never be appeased with less than his death. He himself would have said that whatever there was of courage in his conduct was due to the strength that came to him from prayer. It was his consolation and the sources of the energy which enabled him to stand not only the pain he had to suffer, but to suppress any manifestations with regard to it and keep on with his work. There is an impression in many minds that as time goes on and medicine and surgery advance and science scores further triumphs, pain and ill health generally will decrease, and there will not be so nearly much necessity for standing pain as there is even at the present time. Besides, it is thought that the discovery of new modes of stilling pain will still further eliminate the necessity for patience. As a matter of fact, all our advance in hygiene and sanitation and scientific medicine has served rather to increase than lessen the amount of pain. People now live longer than they used to. They live on to die of the degenerative diseases which are slow-running and often involve a great deal of pain over a prolonged period. One reason, probably the most important one, for the great increase in the number of deaths from cancer in recent years is the fact that ever so many more people now live on to the cancer age than before. Every year beyond 40 which a human being lives increases the liability of death from cancer in that individual. There are some enthusiasts in the field of medicine who are inclined to think that we may discover the cause of cancer and eliminate the disease. But after a generation of special effort in that direction, with absolutely no hopeful outlook, this is at least a dubious prospect. Indeed, there are many good authorities on the subject who are inclined to feel that cancer more often represents an embryologic or developmental defect than almost anything else, and that insofar as it does, we can scarcely hope ever to eliminate it. While the death rate from other acute diseases has been decreasing in recent years, and especially from the infectious diseases, the mortality from affections of the kidneys, heart, and brain has been increasing. Almost needless to say, these affections are practically always chronic, involve definite discomfort when not positively acute suffering, and not infrequently produce bodily states in which people must bear patiently a great deal of discomfort, sometimes for years. When people live beyond middle life, they become more and more liable to be affected by these diseases, so that instead of needing less consolation for pain, our generation and the immediately succeeding generations at least are going to need more. It is particularly the people who are stricken with chronic disease who need the consolation afforded by religion. Above all, when they know that their affection is essentially incurable and that the only absolute relief they can have will come from death. It is with this as regard to hospitals and charity. The greater the advance in medicine and the longer people are kept in life, the more need there will be for hospital care and consequently for the exercise of charity in the best sense of that word, and also for patience in pain and suffering. In these matters, as with regard to knowledge, science, instead of lessening the need of religion and its influence, is multiplying it. There is not the slightest reason for thinking that a man will ever make here on earth a heaven in which he may be perfectly happy, and even those enthusiastic advocates of modern progress who are inclined to think of the possibility of this set the date of it so far forward in the future, especially since the disillusionizing process of the Great War, that even the fulfillment of their prophecy is not likely to do very much good for our generation, or for many subsequent generations. We are going to need the consolations afforded by religion even more than our forefathers did in the past, now that physicians are able to prolong life and yet cannot entirely do away with suffering. Above all, it must not be forgotten that the cult of comfort and convenience, and what may well be called the habit of luxury in the modern time, has greatly increased sensitiveness to pain. There are two elements that enter into suffering, as we have said in the chapter on that subject. The one is the irritation of a sensitive nerve, and the other is the reaction to it in the mind of the sufferer. If, for any reason, the nerve has been rendered insensitive, or the mind put in a condition where it cannot receive the irritation, the subject will not feel the pain. If anything has happened to increase the irritability of a nerve, as happens, for instance, when continued irritation has brought more blood to the part than usual, and the affected area is hyperemic and swollen, the pain will be greater because the nerve is more sensitive. If anything happens to make the mind more receptive of pain, and especially if the pain message that comes up along the nerve is diffused over a large part of the brain because there is a concentration of attention on it, then too the pain will be ever so much worse. We are in various ways adding to this subjective element of pain and therefore increasing it. We are going to need then all the possible consolation that can be afforded by religious motives. In an article written for the International Clinics on neurotic discomfort and the law of avalanche, I called attention to how much even comparatively mild pains can be increased by concentration of attention. The law of avalanche is a term employed by Ramon y Cajal to indicate the mode by which very simple sensations at the periphery of the body may be multiplied into an avalanche of sensations within the brain. In a lecture for his International Clinics, Professor Ramon y Cajal said, "Impressions are made upon single cells at the periphery. As the result of the disturbance of the single cell, an ever-increasing number of cells are affected as the nervous impulse travels toward the nerve center. Finally, the nervous impulses reach the brain and are spread over a considerable group of pyramidal cells in the cortex." In his paragraphs on attention, he says that if conscious attention is paid to the sensation, a great many other cells throughout the brain become affected by it. It may be that every cell which subtends consciousness will at a given moment of intense attention be tingling from a single sensation. If it is unpleasant, the unpleasantness is multiplied to a very serious degree. The law of avalanche has a very large place in disturbing the lives of those people who have much time on their hands to think about themselves, and who are always solicitous lest some serious condition should be developing. Our self-conscious generation, as religious impressions have been diminished in recent years, is making its pains ever so much more difficult to bear than they were before. Paying attention to slight discomfort will quite literally turn it into a veritable torment. Prayer of itself, by distracting the attention, will act in an actual physical manner to reduce the pain, and the habit of prayer could accomplish very much in that direction. The feeling that somehow the pain that is being borne is not merely a useless torment, but has a dual beneficial effect in strengthening character and storing up merit for the hereafter, as the religious-minded believe, will do a very great deal to make the pain more bearable. As we are not going to have less pain for humanity, and suffering and death are to be always with us, not even the most roseate dreams of medical scientists contemplating their elimination, it is easy to understand how valuable religious motives will continue to be. Meantime, physicians have abundance of experience of how much religion can do to make life, even under the most trying circumstances, not only useful for self and others, but even satisfying for those who would otherwise find it an almost intolerable burden. Probably the most fruitful source of consolation to be found in life is contained in the profound conviction that the Lord and Master said to those who would come after him that if they would be his disciples, they must take up their cross and follow him. One of the very great books of world literature is The Imitation of Christ, the keynote of which is contained in its title. This little book, which has chapters bearing such titles as That a Man Must Not Be Overeager About His Affairs, and That a Man Has Nothing Good of Himself, and which suggests that true comfort must be sought in God alone, and that all care should be cast upon God, and that worldly honor must be held in contempt, and that all things, however grievous, are to be borne for the sake of eternal life, and that a man ought to consider himself more worthy of chastisement than of consolation, has been the favorite reading of more of the men and women whose opinions are worthwhile in the world's history than probably any other, with the exception of the Bible itself. It has been placed next to Homer and Dante and Shakespeare among the books which scholars would preserve if, by a cataclysm, all the other books in the world were to be destroyed. When, some years ago, there was a spirited discussion in the English newspapers and magazines as to the 10 books which should be selected if one were to be on a desert island for the rest of life with only these 10 books for company, The Imitation of Christ almost invariably found its way into the list, and usually among the first 5. If the little book which emphasizes the pain and suffering of life has come to be looked upon as one of the greatest books of the world, by the very fact of its profound treatment of this subject in lofty poetry, then it is easy to understand the place that pain bears in life. It is at the very heart of it. Nothing so reveals its meaning and makes it so bearable as religion. Just as it is true with regard to suffering, as stated in the chapter on that subject, that the 5 poets, who at long separated intervals in the world's history dared to take the mystery of suffering in the world for the subject of their poems, made by that very fact the greatest dramatic poetry that has ever been made. So this humble member of the Brethren of the Common Life, Thomas à Kempis, working just as the Renaissance was beginning, and writing the spiritual conferences for those humble-minded, patient teachers and thinkers, as Hamilton maybe said, whose devotion and fire of soul for a century and a half made the choice treasures of Italian palaces and convents and universities a common possession along the low-lying shores of the Netherlands, composed what his contemporaries called ecclesiastical music, and what all subsequent generations have agreed in thinking the most wonderful expression of the significance of life in terms of Christianity that has ever been written. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Religion and Health. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Owlivia. Religion and Health by James Joseph Walsh. Chapter 16. Suicide and Homicide. No book on religion and health would be complete without a discussion of the effect of religious influence on these two very important factors in modern mortality statistics, especially in our own country, suicide and homicide. One of the most disturbing features of public health work is the occurrence of such a large number of deaths every year in our great city life from murder and self-murder. It is discouraging to have the death rate from nearly every form of disease coming down while these are going up. Any factor which promises, however modestly, to remove even to a slight degree this stigma from our modern civilization is worthy of consideration. The moral factors in life are the most important in this regard, and over these, religion has the most direct and potent influence. One of the most disturbing features of our modern life is the fact that in spite of the notable progressive increase of comfort in life, far beyond what people enjoyed in the past, there has been a steadily mounting growth in the number of suicides every year in civilized countries. Comforts and conveniences have become widely diffused, so that the luxuries of the rich in the older time have become the everyday commonplaces of the poor or the simple necessities of the middle class, and life would seem to be ever so much more easy than it used to be. Yet more and more people find it so hard that they are willing to go out of life by their own hands to meet untimely the dark mystery of the future. It has become quite manifest that the comfort of body and peace of mind are by no means in such direct ratio to one another as is usually thought, but rather the contrary. Our suicides take place more frequently among the better-to-do classes than among the poor, who might possibly be expected to find life so hard that they could not stand it any longer. Even chronic suffering does not cause so many suicides as the various disappointments of life, most of which are only transitory in their effect. Perhaps the most disturbing feature of the suicide situation lies in the fact that the average age of those who commit suicide every year is constantly becoming younger. Suicide used to be the resort, particularly among the discouraged beyond middle life. But now it is becoming ever more and more the mode of escape from an immediate future of unhappiness which ever younger and younger folk foresee for themselves. Disappointments in love have always been occasions for suicide, but other causes have multiplied in recent years to an alarming degree. And now high school children, with the suggestion of sensational newspaper accounts of suicide in their minds, turn to self-murder over failures in examination or setbacks in schoolwork or over a scolding at home. Even below the age of 15, suicides are reported rather frequently because children have been punished or have been refused something that they had set their hearts on. The generation is engaged in producing many oversensitive young folk who cannot stand being disturbed in their hopes and aspirations. Suicides have increased just in proportion to the decrease of attention to religion and the absence of religious teaching, and above all, religious training, that is, of such practice of self-denial and of mortification for religious motives as leads to formation of character. When children and young folks are always given their own way and are not taught that denying themselves is of itself a virtue because it leads to strength of willpower and enables one to stand the inevitable hardships of later life, No wonder that their first serious disappointments come to them as such disturbing misfortunes that they can scarcely picture to themselves a time when they shall be happy again. Above all, a great many of them have no real belief in immortality, and therefore face the future life with no feeling as to its mystery, and no proper sense of their obligation toward a Creator who gave them life to use to the best advantage possible, and who wants them to play the game of life fair, taking the ill with the good and carrying on. The lack of religious feeling has left them with nothing to cling to in the midst of their trials, and though they may have friends, all human beings are eminently alone, and we must go through what is hard in life by ourselves. We never feel our loneliness more than when some severe trial comes. We almost resent the pity of others, and Emerson's phrase that we are infinitely repellent particles becomes a very grave reality. It is the easy custom of our time to blame nearly all the social ills on what is called our present-day strenuous existence. There are a great many people who seem to think that men never worked so hard as they do now, though as a matter of fact, in what concerns the accomplishment of things worthwhile, our generation is sadly backward. He unfortunately grows preoccupied with trivial, narrow concerns and keeps on working at them so continuously that we have become very fussy folk because we have no variety of occupation to relieve the strain of daily life. It must not be forgotten in this regard that some of the men who have lived the longest have been extremely hard workers, accomplishing so much in a number of lines of thought and endeavor that it has seemed almost impossible to understand how they did it. Yet they have been healthy and hearty in mind and body until 80 years, and sometimes, like Rank, the great German historian, and Pope Leo XIII, and Chevreul, the distinguished French chemist, even beyond 90 years of age and more. The strenuous existence is a good excuse, however, and a great many people are sure that it is overtiredness and the disturbance of health and the depression which comes in connection with this that causes suicide, or at least contributes greatly to the increase of it in our time. Only a little analysis of suicide statistics, however, is necessary to make it very clear that it is not physical factors which contribute most to the increase of suicide, but that it is the state of mind of the individual. If the physical counted for much, then it would be confidently expected that suicides would be commonest in the winter and least frequent in the summer, particularly in the pleasanter months of the summertime. The statistics show, however, that the month which has the most suicides is June. June is probably the pleasantest month of the year in most ways in our climate. July is likely to be very hot. May often has cold and rainy days at the beginning, but June has often a succession of almost perfect days. James Russell Lowell sang, and it has been re-echoed many times, "What is so rare as a day in June?" Yet this is the month which more people take to put themselves out of existence than any other. Brides have chosen it as the favorite month for marriage because all nature looks so lovely and in sympathy with their own joy, and because there are fewer rainy days in it than any other. Happy hearts are beginning a new existence with the brightest possible projects, just when so many others are voluntarily getting out of what seems a hopeless life. December, which has so many gloomy days, and which naturally is likely to be so much more depressing than the succeeding months of the winter, for the clear cold days of January and February are bracing, might on physical grounds be expected to be the month with the most suicides in it. Christmas, with its celebrations and the announcement of peace and joy to men of goodwill, might be expected to lower the number of suicides for the latter third of the month, but even the joy of that occasion could scarcely be hoped to neutralize completely the depressing effect of the weather. Just exactly the contradiction of these anticipations is what happens. Suicides are least frequent in December of any month in the year, and the last 10 days of the month have the most of them because it is not so much the individual's own sense of hopelessness in life, complicated by physical suffering and material trials of various kinds, that tempts to suicide, as the contrast of the joy of those around him with his own feelings, which emphasize his depressed state of mind until he feels that he can stand it no longer. June's gaiety with its happy brides adds to the number of suicides, and the Christmas festivities have a like unfortunate tendency. Gloomy weather has exactly the opposite effect from what would surely have been expected on the general principles that the physical plays the most important role in the production of suicides. This is brought out still more clearly by the careful review of the effect of weather on suicide, which was made some years ago by Professor Edmund T. Dexter of the University of Illinois. He followed the records of nearly 2,000 cases of suicides reported to the police in the city of New York and placed beside them the records of the Weather Bureau of the same city for the days on which these suicides occurred. According to this, which represents not any preconceived notions, but the realities of the relationship of the weather to self-murder, the tendency to suicide is highest in spring and summer, and the deed is accomplished in the greatest majority of cases on the sunniest days of these seasons. It is not at all a case of heat disturbance of mind or tendency to heat stroke, for, as has been seen, June is the month of the most suicides, and while it often has some hot days, it does not compare in this regard with July and August, or even September as a rule. His conclusions are carefully drawn, and there is no doubt that they must be accepted as representing the actual facts. All the world feels depressed on rainy days and in dark, cloudy weather. But suicides react well, as a rule, against this physical depression, yet allow their mental depression to get the better of them on the finest days of the year. Professor Dexter said, "The clear, dry days show the greatest number of suicides, and the wet, partially cloudy days the least, and with differences too great to be attributed to accident or chance. In fact, there are nearly 1 in 3 more suicides on dry than on wet days, and more than 1 in 5 more on clear days than on days that are partly cloudy." In reviewing the subject of suicide in my book on psychotherapy, I suggested that this subject of depressed weather conditions as the contributing cause of suicide might be carried still farther, and the lack of the dispiriting influence of dark, damp weather as a suicide factor could be seen very strikingly from the suicide statistics of various climates. The suicide rate is not highest in the torrid or in the frigid zones, but in the temperate zones. In the north temperate zone, it is much more marked than in the south temperate zone. Civilization and culture, diffused to a much greater extent in the north temperate zone than in the south, seem to be the main reason for this difference. We make people capable of feeling pain more poignantly, but do not add to their power to stand trials or train character by self-control to make the best of life under reasonably severe conditions. Severe physical suffering of any kind, provided it is shared by a whole people, reduces the suicide rate. Famine, for instance, though it might be expected that people facing starvation would surely take the easier way, rather reduces the tendency to suicide. Earthquakes, followed by loss of life and intense suffering, have the same effect. It might possibly be thought that this would be only true among the less well-educated people, the Orientals, or perhaps certain of the South Americans, where lack of education made them less poignantly sensitive to physical suffering than the more refined people in our Western civilization. But the earthquake at San Francisco demonstrated very clearly the effect upon average Californians, who, I suppose, must be considered to have been rather a little above than below the general run of Americans in what we are accustomed to call civilization and education. Before the catastrophe, suicides were occurring in that city on an average of 12 a week. After the earthquake, when, if physical sufferings had anything to do with suicide, it might be expected that the self-murder rate would go up. There was so great a reduction that only 3 suicides were reported in 2 months. Some of this reduction was due to inadequate records, but there can be no doubt that literally 100 lives were saved from suicide by the awful catastrophe that leveled the city. Men and women were homeless, destitute, and exposed to every kind of hardship, yet because all those around them were suffering in the same way, everyone seemed to be reasonably satisfied. Evidently, a comparison with the conditions in which others are has much to do with deciding the would-be suicide to make away with himself, for by dwelling too much on his own state, he is prone to think that he is ever so much worse off than others. If life were always vividly interesting, as it was in San Francisco after the earthquake, and if all men worked and suffered as the San Franciscans did for a few weeks, suicide would not end more than 10,000 American lives every year, as it does now. The one hope for the man who is contemplating suicide is to get him interested in others, to arouse him to the realization of the fact that there are others suffering even more than himself, but above all, to get him to feel that he can relieve the suffering of others. Selfishness is the root of suicide, usually pathological in its utter preoccupation with self as the most interesting thing in the universe, but often only the result of a fostering of self-interest and a failure to train the mind to think of other people, which is of the very essence of religion. It is not when things are made easy for mankind, but on the contrary, when they are passing through times of difficulty and severe stress, that the suicide rate goes down. War always brings a striking reduction in the number of suicides. Our Spanish-American War reduced the death rate from suicide in this country over 40% throughout the country and over 50% in Washington itself, where there was most excitement with regard to the war. This was true also during the Civil War. Our minimum annual death rate from suicide from 1805, when statistics on this subject began to be capped, to the present time was one suicide to about 24,000 people, which occurred in 1864, when our Civil War was in its severest phase. There had been constant increase in our suicide rate every year until the Civil War began. Then there was a drop at once, and this continued until the end of the war. In New York City, the average rate of suicide for the 5 years of the Civil War was nearly 45% lower than the average for the 5 following years. In Massachusetts, where the statistics were gathered very carefully, the number of suicides for the 5-year period before 1860 was nearly 20% greater than for the 5-year period immediately following, which represents the preliminary excitement over the war and the actual year of the war. This experience in America is only in accordance with what happens everywhere. Mr. George Kennan, in his article on The Problems of Suicide, has a paragraph which brings this out very well. He says, quote, "In Europe, the restraining influence of war upon the suicidal impulse is equally marked. The war between Austria and Italy in 1866 decreased the suicide rate for each country about 14%. The Franco-German War of 1870 through 1871 lowered the suicide rate of Saxony 8%, that of Prussia 11.4%, and that of France 18.7%. The reduction was greatest in France because the German invasion of that country made the war excitement there much more general and intense than it was in Saxony or Prussia. Above all, the sense of patriotic duty, the recognition of the fact that there are things in life worth more than life itself, lifts men out of the depression into which they have permitted themselves to be plunged as a consequence of their utter absorption in themselves and their own narrow interests. Old-fashioned religion has a distinct effect in the reduction of the suicide rate, and all over the world, the Orthodox Jews who cling to their old-time belief, and above all to their Orthodox practices and mode of life, have undoubtedly the lowest suicide rate of any people in the world. This is true, though almost needless to say, a great many Jews, not only in the foreign countries, but here in our own great cities, have to live under circumstances that are the most trying that it is possible to imagine. A great many of them live in slums, doing intensely hard work in sweatshops, though, thank God, these are fewer now than they used to be. And yet the Jews cling to life in the midst of trials that would seem almost impossible for human nature to bear. The Jewish suicide rate is the lowest everywhere, in spite of racial differences. For after all, there are German Jews and Portuguese Jews and Russian Jews who have lived among the respective peoples after whom they are called for centuries, and who might therefore be expected to take on the characteristics which their environments have brought. There is a very great difference in the suicide rate between the Orthodox and unorthodox Jews, that is, those who have given up the beliefs and religious practices of their forefathers. It is in favor of the Orthodox Jews, though of course the record is complicated by the prosperity of those who have given up their religion. Wealth and speculation greatly favor the occurrence of suicide. It is well known that Roman Catholics the world over have much less tendency to suicide than their Protestant neighbors living in the same communities. It is true that where the national suicide rate is high, many Catholics also commit suicide, but there is a distinct disproportion between them and their neighbors. The suicide rate of Protestants in the north part of Ireland, as pointed out by Mr. George Kennan, is twice that of Roman Catholics in the southern part. He discusses certain factors that would seem to modify the breadth of the conclusion that might be drawn from this, but in the end he confesses that their faith probably has the most to do with it, and that, above all, the practice of sacramental confession must be considered as tending to lessen the suicide rate materially. It is the readiness to give their confidence to someone on the part of these patients, for that is what they really are, that seems to the physician the best hope of helping them to combat their impulse. And Mr. Kennan's opinion is worth recalling for therapeutic purposes. Quote, In view of the fact that the suicide rate of the Protestant canton in Switzerland is nearly 4 times that of Catholic cantons, it seems probable that Catholicism, as a form of religious belief, does restrain the suicidal impulse. The efficient cause may be the Catholic practice of confessing to priests, which probably gives much encouragement and consolation to unhappy but devout believers, and thus induces many of them to struggle on in spite of misfortune and depression." End quote. It is not surprising that in countries where attendance at church and adhesion to religious organizations has dropped very seriously, that the suicide rate should be higher than in countries where the great mass of the people are still faithful churchgoers, take their religious duties very seriously, and therefore are subjected to the deepest influence of religion over the heart and mind at regularly occurring intervals. They find consolation in their suffering, advice in their trials, strength for their difficulties, and a fount of hope, almost, for their despair. Above all, they are deterred by the thought of another world than this, and the possibility of punishment in it, if they have not had the courage and the manly strength of soul to face their difficulties in this. It has come to be the custom, rather, to minimize the effect of deterrent motives on human beings, and to say that men cannot be scared into doing good or avoiding evil, and that it is quite true that a policy of frightfulness pursued out of mere malice to effect a human purpose will have exactly the opposite effect over the great majority of mankind. But where men realize that they are bringing punishment on themselves by their own acts, and that these acts are unjustifiable on any rational grounds, they have a very different feeling, as a rule, with regard to punishments that may be impending over them for their conduct. It is quite one thing to be unjustly punished and resent it, and quite another to feel that the punishment we are incurring has justice in it, though we may not be quite able to understand all the significance of it, or plumb its mystery entirely. Shakespeare has Hamlet discuss that whole question in his soliloquy so well that it deserves to be quoted here. "And by a sleep, to say we end the heartache, and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die? To sleep? To sleep, perchance to dream. Ah, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than to fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all." We have come to resent somewhat the suggestion of deterrent motives as helpful for the doing of good, and the dread of punishment as unworthy of men. But the religious beliefs of a hereafter of suffering for the coward who dares not face the trials of life are still, and have always been, valuable in keeping people up to their duty. The war restored some of the sadly needed old-fashioned attitude toward punishment as a help to discipline, and we are now more in sympathy with old-fashioned religious ideas in the matter. There has been an even greater increase of homicide than of suicide, and for very similar reasons. Our homicide rate here in America is a disgrace to a civilized country. Ambassador Andrew D. White, whose long experience in European countries made his opinion of great value, declared that for homicide we were the worst country in the world, with more killings of human beings to our credit than even vendetta-ridden Corsica. This is not due to any persistence of Wild West conditions, but obtains in the East as well as in the West. Indeed, our large cities are by far the worst in this regard. New York and Chicago have many times as many murders annually as London has, though there is no very great difference in the composition of the population of these cities, for all of them house large numbers of foreigners of all kinds, and they have about the same sort of slums and very nearly the same social conditions. Poverty is worse in London, and if anything, that ought to add to the homicide rate. Reverence for human life has very largely broken down, and the taking of it is not considered to be anything like the serious crime that it was even a few years ago. This increase in homicide in civilized countries, like the increase in suicide, has come after the serious breakdown of religion. That the rise in the homicide rate is not a question of the familiar fallacy post hoc ergo propter hoc, that is, after this, therefore because of this, is the opinion of a number of men who have a right to have opinions on this subject and who insist that it is the obliteration of religious feeling with its emphatic insistence upon the awfulness of the crime of murder that has largely served to make homicide the very common event that it is. One powerful factor in this matter is undoubtedly the failure to punish murder properly, and, as far as may be, adequately, that has developed in recent years in this country. Very few murderers are executed. Less than 5% altogether of those who have committed deliberate murder are ever executed, and in some states it is actually only 2%. When but 2 out of every 100 men who take life deliberately lose theirs, it is easy to understand that men, in times of intense anger, will not have the restraint which would otherwise be exerted over them by the fear of prompt loss of life under disgraceful circumstances for themselves. Many a man will take his chances of having a long prison term for murder, shortened by executive clemency or a pardon board, who would hesitate very much over the thought of having to die himself by prompt legal measure. I have heard a distinguished jurist say that they execute 9 out of 10 of their murderers in England, while we execute little more than 2 out of every 100 on the average of ours, so that there is little reason for wonder why we have 10 times as many murders. The real reason for this decrease in the number of executions and the growth of the opposition on principle to capital punishment in this country is the increasing obscuration of the belief in immortality. People have become afraid to do the irretrievable act of sending a man out of life because, thinking only in terms of this life, they feel he should have a chance for reform here, and above all, they hesitate to think that men ever have the right to deprive another of existence. For if there is no other world than this, the end of physical life means annihilation. If life is but the portal to eternity, however, at longest a brief period of trial before entering upon another and much more important stage of existence, then the execution of a criminal, done with all the dignity of the law, exacting a compensation as adequate as possible for a wrong that has been done, instead of being a dreadful thing, has a very definite nobility about it. Of course, if there is no other world, the question of execution becomes a very different consideration, the obliteration of a fellow human being. This feeling is often not consciously reflected upon, yet it is effective in suggesting conclusions and ruling the mental attitude. The old religious orders had a tradition that certain men, because of the circumstances in which they died, and above all the fact that they had sufficient warning as to the end of life and the chance to prepare themselves for eternity, were predestined to heaven, though they might have to go through a great deal of suffering, quite as Dante foresaw, before getting there. Among these most prominent classes were men and women afflicted with an incurable disease, which it was recognized would surely bring on a fatal conclusion with but a few months or years' delay. And then those who were condemned to death had their weeks and months of preparation in prison for that event. This intense belief in a hereafter made the outlook on both murder and execution a very different thing from what it is without it. Sentimentality reigns now where the sentiment of justice formerly ruled. A man who has committed an ugly sex crime, capped with murder, or who has often, after making her life miserable for months or years, murdered a poor wife in cold-blooded deliberateness, will be the subject of sentimental compassion during his trial from a crowd of silly women who will send flowers to his cell to lighten his solitude, and who, if they can obtain permission, will visit him in the death house. They forget that his victim suffered, and the necessity for producing a definite effect upon the minds of others who might have the temptation to follow in his path, and whose minds are of a caliber that they can only be deterred by holding up adequate punishment before them. The gradual diminution of the place of religion in life has given rise to an unfortunate phase of popular psychology with regard to the effect of punishment in general on human beings. The wisest writings that we have, the Holy Scriptures, which even those who might deny their direct divine inspiration would confess readily to contain the most marvelous knowledge of man and his ways to be found in literature, have insisted particularly on the deterrent effect of punishment held up before men, and the reforming value of it when properly inflicted. Probably nowhere in modern social life is a revival of religion more needed to save men from unfortunate tendencies in their natures than in what concerns the estimation of the value of human life and the prevention of a further increase in our awful statistics of suicide and homicide. Religion is almost more needed for this than for the so-called social diseases. End of chapter 16. Recorded by Owlivia.
Chapter 17 of Religion and Health. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Religion and Health by James Joseph Walsh. Chapter 17. Longevity. In spite of the psalmist's warning that 70 are the years of man, and that life beyond that is likely to be filled with all sorts of discomforts, practically all men are anxious to live long lives. They are satisfied to take the diseases of advanced years provided only there are surceases from pain at intervals, and they are able to occupy themselves for some part of the time with their usual interests. It is true that a certain sadly increasing number in our time shorten existence by their own hand, and at an ever younger age on the average, and that some at least of those who do so are not insane in any justifiable legal sense of the word, but they are felt by all to be unfortunate exceptions who prove that the rule of love of life and desire to cling to it through sad and evil case is practically universal among men. Life may be, in the words of the cynic, a chronic disease, whose termination is always death, but most men prefer that the disease should last as long as possible. The most important factor for long life is of course heredity. The man who wants to live long should have been careful to be born of long-lived parents and grandparents. Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said that the physician would often like to be in the position to treat in the persons of his patients' grandparents a number of the diseases that he sees in his consulting room. Whatever truth there may be in that, there is no doubt at all that there is very little hope of a man living long if his parents and grandparents have been short-lived, unless of course their taking off has been due to accident. After family heredity, however, undoubtedly the most important factor for longevity is an abiding sense of religion. A great many religious people live beyond the average age, and a great many clergymen live to be very old men, and yet retain their faculties and physical powers very well. They are not longer lived than other professional men on the average, because many of those who become clergymen are delicate by nature and only rarely so robust as other college men. In recent years the insurance companies have come to recognize very clearly what is called the moral hazard in life. A man who lives a quiet, simple life without excesses in eating or drinking, getting his full quota of sleep and his meals regularly without temptations to high living of various kinds, is much more likely to outlive his mathematical average of expectancy in life than the man who does not follow that sort of existence. Almost needless to say, it is seriously religious men, all clergymen do not necessarily come under this head, who live these very regular lives and do not allow themselves the occasional divagations in life which may not in themselves prove serious, but which often lead to conditions and developments that impair health and shorten existence. There are undoubtedly a good many men who have sowed their wild oats very freely when they were young and who have continued all their lives to be rather free livers, and who yet have lived on to good round old age. What we speak of here, however, is the average length of life which in men who live without excesses and without over-solicitude about the future or the present is sure to be longer than in others. The old proverb says that worry and not work kills men. undoubtedly worry rather than work ages men before their time and breaks down their vital resistance and makes them much more susceptible to the many diseases that may shorten existence as the years go on than they would have been liable to had they lived regular lives. Religion is the great salve for worries. When genuine, it lessens the irritations of life, makes them more bearable, renders the disposition more equable and more capable of standing the stresses and strains of sudden trials or serious misfortunes than it would otherwise be. Religion does not change nature essentially, but it lifts it up and modifies it to a noteworthy degree. Even Christ did not come to change human nature. He assumed it and showed men how to live. Religion does not make a passionate disposition mild, but it confers upon the passionate man the power to control his passions to no small extent and often so thoroughly that even those who know him best have no idea of the storms which start to brew within him but are suppressed. Almost needless to say, the moderation in all things which religion counsels and which its training fosters is extremely conducive to long life, if there is any underlying basis for that in the nature of the individual. Religion is like oil for machinery. It lessens the friction, prevents the development of heat, which would only be destructive and serve no useful purpose, soothes the temper against reactions and soothes out life's ways. Someone once suggested that it represented the rubber tires of the modern automobile, but that is not a good figure, for the inflation on which a man is smoothly carried may blow out at any moment and leave him to run on the rim. That is much better represented by sentimentality and the motives drawn from it rather than from religion. The direct influence of religion on health can very probably be estimated best by the comparative death rate of occupations. Clergymen, according to English statistics, which are gathered rather carefully, have the lowest death rate, even below that of gardeners and nurserymen, whose constant outdoors life gives them such an advantage, and whose simple laborious occupation without excitement is so favorable for long life. After these come the farmers, and then the agricultural laborers, and then a long distance afterwards the schoolmasters and grocers and mechanics generally. The highest death rates in occupations occur not among the laboring classes occupied at the particularly unhealthy trades, plumbers and painters who are subjected to lead, file makers and knife grinders whose lungs are seriously hurt by dust, and earthenware manufacturers who are subjected to the influence of both dust and lead, but among the innkeepers, spirit, wine and beer dealers, and above all the inn and hotel servants, among whom the moral hazards of life are greatly increased, and over whom religion fails to have the influence that would be beneficial. Perhaps the best way to demonstrate the effect of religion in lessening the wear and tear of life, thus proving conducive to its prolongation, is to take the statistics of the lives of those who devote themselves so thoroughly to their religious duties that they are called by the name religious. They give themselves not alone to the daily but almost to the hourly practice of religion, and its influence has a thoroughgoing opportunity to exert itself over their lives. Most of them live very simply and abstemiously, and indeed many people would be inclined to say that they did not take quite sufficient food to nourish them properly, and that they allowed their sleep to be interrupted by religious duties in such ways as not to afford themselves quite rest enough. They are all very early risers, at 5 o'clock in the winter at the latest and in summer at 4, while not a few of them get up at some hour during the night to sing some portion of the office, the full round of which has to be completed every day. Their beds are usually rather hard. There is no carpet on the floor in their cells. Their lives to most people would seem rather narrow and without adequate diversion, and yet they are noted for living beyond the average age, except in cases where work in hospitals or the like subjects them to the danger of infection. The tradition with regard to this prolongation of life among the religious has existed since a very early time in Christianity, and indeed was noted before the Christian era among the men and women who, as among the Buddhists, live in monastic seclusion lives of great abstinence and occupation with the contemplation of the hereafter. In the very early days of Christianity a number of the men who withdrew to live the lives of solitaries in the desert regions of Egypt and of Syria exceeded the psalmist's limit of life, though the account of their neglect of food would seem to make that almost impossible. A number of them lived to be beyond 70 and not a few beyond 80, and some of them over 90. St. Anthony, who is often spoken of as the first hermit, lived to be beyond 100. It is a matter of never-ending surprise to find how many people who dwell in monasteries, where their occupation is mainly some simple work of the hands varied by long hours of reading and prayer during every day in the year, live to be very old. It might be surmised that their opportunities for introspection and thought about themselves would be so frequent and extensive that they would get on their own minds, and probably be the victims of various nervous symptoms that would shorten existence through worries over trifles. So far is this from being the case, however, that some of the most striking examples of group longevity among people who are unrelated are to be found in what are known as contemplative monasteries, that is, institutions where there is only enough active life every day necessary to maintain health and supplies for the simple physical needs of a monastery, and the rest of the time is spent in reading, prayer, meditation and the saying of the divine office. The modern religious orders, which imitate some at least of the austerities of the old solitaries, and those who in the early days of Christianity lived in communities, have a record of longevity quite equal to that of their forebears. What an absolutely regular life under deep religious influences, where practically every hour of the day has its allotted task, where no meat is eaten, and 2 Lents a year are kept, that is 1/3 less is eaten for about 1/4 of the year, will do to prolong human life, can be seen very well from the vital statistics of the well-known Trappist monastery at Gethsemane in Kentucky, which are before me as I write. The average age at death of the members of this community for the last 25 years is nearly 73. A number of them live to be beyond 80. And as the abbot has written to tell me, the most satisfactory thing for the community lies in the fact that the old members, even at 80 years and more, can practically always join in the common life of the community and do not need to be specially waited on or taken care of. Their death is likely to be quiet and rather easy, the flickering out of the spark of life rather than its extinction. One of the Benedictines has furnished me statistics for that order here in America, for there might be the feeling that in other countries life would be different, and that longevity would occur for different reasons than those which occasion it in this country. A great many among the Benedictines live to celebrate their golden jubilee, and life among them has been calculated to be at least 10 years more than that of their brothers and sisters who remained in the world. Of course it might be said that only the people of very placid disposition who take things very quietly and are not inclined to worry would enter such institutions as these, and there is some truth in the statement. It is not nearly so true, however, as most people would imagine, for a great many of those who enter convents and monasteries were rather lively and gay when they were younger. Indeed, it has often been said that it was the liveliest, happiest and most charming girls at the convent schools who were destined to enter the convents afterwards. As regards the monasteries for men, the same rule of longevity holds, and yet a great many of these men were not only lively and gay, but some of them had rather stormy careers before they settled down to the contemplative life after something of remorse over the foolishness which had led them astray in their younger years. The men and women who enter religious orders are of course the more serious characters who take life rather placidly, and this adds to their expectancy of life, for it is worry rather than work or suffering that shortens existence. But it must not be forgotten that not a little of their placidity is not natural to their dispositions, but is rather acquired as the result of their deep religious feelings and their recognition of the fact that God's will be accomplished anyhow, and there is no use worrying about things. Undoubtedly one of the principal reasons why the death rate among women at all ages is so much more favorable than might be expected, in spite of their apparent tendency to worry more, their nervousness about many things, and the dangers of maternity as well as their weaker physical constitution, is to be found in the fact that religious influences are much more profound over them and have a more calming effect than over men. A very old expression calls women the devout female sex, and the influence of their devotion to religion is reflected in their mortality statistics. Dr. Woods Hutchinson, in his Civilization and Health, footnote 16, Boston, 1914, has a chapter on the hardy nerves of women, in which he brings out the fact that women resist the corroding effect of the strenuous life of modern civilization better than men, and are not subject to the factors which have made modern health statistics so disturbing. For while we have been lengthening the average term of life, and reducing the death rate in general, we have been shocked to find that the mortality above 45 has been increasing rather than decreasing, so that men are being taken off just at the prime of life and at the height of their usefulness more than ever before, in spite of all our hygiene and the development of sanitary science. The difference in mortality between men and women after the age of 45, that is, just at the time when religious feelings are likely to represent so much of a resource for the devout female sex, is so striking as to deserve to be noted particularly, and the contrast continues more and more to be emphasized as the years go on. The average age at death has risen during the past generation from about 33 to slightly above 50, but this improvement has been chiefly effected by saving the babies and children from death from unclean milk and the acute infectious diseases, and young adults from the great plagues of past generations, typhoid and tuberculosis. Dr. Hutchinson goes on to say, naturally this preserves a much larger number of individuals to live to, say, the age of 45, and, as we must all die some time, we begin to drop off somewhat more rapidly after this point has been reached. That is to say, the stupid and helpless creature, man, does. Woman, however, is far too shrewd for that, while man's mortality, after falling off markedly up to 45 years, begins after that period to increase distinctly. Woman's death rate, on the other hand, continues to decrease until 55 years of age, beating man 10 years, then yields to the force of circumstances only to the extent of about 1/10 of the increase man shows between 55 and 65, and after 70 proceeds to decrease again. Incidentally, it may be remarked that the total increase of mortality after 45 in man is only about 6%, besides which, the race need not worry much about what happens to the individual after 55 or 60, provided he has done his share of the world's work. But women pass men 3 laps to the mile, for their increase of death rate after the age of 55 is barely 1%, or 1/6 of man's. The lessened death rates among women at all ages are notable, particularly among those who have taken life seriously and religiously. Typical examples of similar longevity, which they themselves would surely have declared to have been influenced more by their religious attitude of mind than by any other single factor, are noteworthy in the lives of the 2 English cardinals of the 19th century, Newman and Manning. Both of them were men who accomplished a very great deal of work in their younger years, and who then went through the serious mental strain of giving up friends that had been very near and dear to them, and making a great revolution in their lives. Both of them lived to be well past 80, and indeed Newman lived to be past 90 in the full possession of vigorous power of mind until the very end of life. He himself had not looked for long life, but on the contrary had felt that he was one of those fated to die rather young. Indeed, in the 60s, he had begun to think that he would give up work, and his friends had settled down to the idea that he would not be long with them, when an attack on his sincerity aroused him to a magnificent response that is one of the precious treasures of 19th century literature, and then for nearly 30 years longer he was a great intellectual force. This same thing is very well illustrated in the lives of the popes of the 19th century, that is, during the period when modern hygiene and sanitation have developed to such an extent as to make the conservative influence of religion on health felt to the best possible effect. The popes all down the centuries have lived far beyond the average of humanity, in spite of the burdens of responsibility placed on them, and even the shortening of life by martyrdom of so many of them at the beginning. Our 19th and 20th century popes have proved wonderful examples of what placidity of mind can do under the most difficult circumstances in keeping worries from wearing out life energies, in spite of the fact that the life stream in some of the cases did not appear to be very strong at its source and long life seemed almost out of the question. These long lives might very well be matched from the lists of old pastors from all the denominations and the sects who have outlived the years of the psalmist without incurring the physical evils which he prophesied. Old clergymen are particularly likely to retain the full possession of their senses and to live on to a quiet, peaceful old age. I once heard one of them say, I believe that it was a quotation, that he used to think that all the pleasure of life was contained in the first 80 years. But now at the age of 85 he knew that there was a great deal of life satisfaction to be found in the second 80 years. There are exceptions to the rule, of course, and most of us would think that they are the sort of exceptions that prove the rule. There is an old saw in many languages which says that the good die young, but physicians are likely to think that this old-fashioned expression is founded on nothing more than the fact that a good many of the weaklings born without very much vitality develop into harmless nonentities who have no strong impulses to either good or ill, and who have but very little resistive vitality and die of the infectious diseases in early youth, or are carried off by tuberculosis a little later. It must not be forgotten, however, that it is as much of an accident to run into a bacillus as into a trolley car, and indeed often more serious, and though all that too is in the hands of the Lord, in the order of providence, secondary causes work out their destined effects. Quite contrary to the tradition that the good die young is the world experience that a great many of the good, that is, men of sterling character and worth who have proved thoroughly capable of doing what is best in life for the benefit of others rather than for themselves, live on to be a source of inspiration to those around them for many, many years of a long and physically active life, even though sometimes they run into the rule that whom the Lord loves he chastens, and they may have had many trials. The scriptural promises made over and over again were that the years of those who should keep his word should be long in the land. That promise has been fulfilled so often as to make it a commonplace. 300 years ago Shakespeare summed up at least the physical effects of keeping the law when he had old Adam say in As You Like It, "Though I look old, yet I am strong and lusty. For in my youth I never did apply hot and rebellious liquors in my blood, nor did not with unbashful forehead woo the means of weakness and debility. Therefore my age is as a lusty winter, frosty, but kindly. Let me go with you. I'll do the service of a younger man in all your business and necessities." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Religion and Health. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Religion and Health by James Joseph Walsh. Chapter 18. The Bible and Health. From the very earliest times, religious legislation has proved an extremely important factor for health. The book of Leviticus, one of the very oldest religious documents that we have, contains a sanitary code which is a marvel of completeness in its prescriptions for the maintenance of health and the prevention of disease. It anticipates most of the modern discoveries in this matter, and the faithful keeping of its regulations has made the Jew the powerful personal factor that he has been so often in history, notwithstanding the fact that he belonged to a despised subject race. The Orthodox Jew has kept his health in spite of the unfavorable conditions in which he was placed much better on the average than the Gentiles around him, and it is for that reason that his nation has been preserved. It would have seemed almost impossible for a people treated so badly as they were, crowded into unhealthy ghettos, often in the lowest and most insanitary parts of the towns, with no municipal care exercised for their health, except when it was feared that epidemics might spread from them to the Gentiles, to have maintained themselves for all these centuries. But they have not only survived, but they have been the most vigorous of people, at all times full of initiative and readiness to work far beyond the average of humanity. The sanitary code of the Jewish people, which is contained in the Old Testament, is one of the greatest triumphs of sanitary legislation that the world has ever known. Dr. Alexander Rattray, in his volumes on Divine Hygiene, Sanitary Science, and Sanitarians of the Sacred Scriptures and Mosaic Code, footnote 17, London 1903, end footnote, has brought this out very clearly. The scriptural motto of his work, that thy way might be known upon earth, thy saving health among all nations, is an excellent text for what he has to say with regard to the sanitary code of the Hebrews, as compared with other ancient documents in sanitation. Dr. Rattray says, indeed, contrasted with the teachings of modern times, the comprehensiveness and sufficiency of the rules and cardinal points comprised in the Hebrew sanitary code, primitive in time but not in practice, ancient but not antiquated and obsolete, comprising a treasure of infallible truth, which is the admiration of all experts, and altogether so remarkable as to be comparable to, if indeed they do not surpass both in literary style and professional excellence, extracts from the best modern works on hygiene, so that savants, notwithstanding their increased anatomical and physiological knowledge, the accumulation of ages and the result of modern enlightenment and civilization, bringing with them vastly improved facilities for medical study, professional experience in hospitals and communities, may still quote his model work with approval, sit with advantage at the feet of the Jewish sage, and learn in language as concise and forcible as that of the best modern thinkers, not only the great base facts, but even many of the less important minutiae of the art and science which they study. If they would not continue to despise this authority because he is a Hebrew, ignore his work because it is Asiatic, slight the book in which it is found because it is not a rare, costly and abstruse volume, spurn instruction on a scientific subject because it comes from a biblical source, and neglect the ready-made and divinely inspired code because it is ancient and a non-professional publication. The question of the place that this health legislation of the Bible has in medical history is worth noting. for it makes very clear that it was no mere human development but something divine. Dr. Rattray said, Moses was no doubt learned in the medicine and surgery of that era, and could at least have taught his old Egyptian teachers, both theoretically and practically, especially in sanitary matters, a science of which they knew little, as the germ thought of preventive medicine had not then been forgotten. But it was not to be his role to indoctrinate the Jews and mankind in the least important sanatory or healing branch of medicine, but rather to initiate its higher and most philosophical department, the sanitary or disease preventing, and to shew both by precept and practice that this is the most philosophic and wisest policy to pursue regarding physical health, as it also is in moral, social, and spiritual matters. Part of his beneficent and divinely inspired mission was to inculcate in those early days the lesson popularly taught in modern times by the trite yet true proverb, "Prevention is better than cure," and to illustrate it on the Israelites, to shew that its scope is not only of private but of national, nay racial, import, and applicable not only to his day, but all time, although grievously neglected in past ages even by medical men. From its biblical study does not medical science thereby appear in a new light, and come in the garb of one of the most incontrovertible aids to human faith in the veracity of Holy Writ, the truth of Scripture as the inspired work of the Almighty, God's medical message to man, sent in His own method, at His own time, and by servants of His own choosing? The Sinaitic or so-called Mosaic Code and its hygienic subcode, more ancient by 500 or 600 years than Aesculapius and the earliest human medical records, was not written and interpolated by any modern or medieval medical sage, but is, as Moses says, an emanation of his era, and yet, as he himself affirms, it was not his conception, but strictly and entirely divine in elaboration, codification, and delivery to humanity. Its true author and deviser was Jehovah, and Moses merely its earthly recipient, editor and human expounder and applier. For this most important educational information we are indebted to God's Holy Bible, and to that alone. What was the supernal object of the code? It was humanitarian and tuitional. The English physician discusses the origin of this code of laws and traces it to divine interposition. Viewed apart from its source, the Hebrew health code is an anachronism, and it must be evident that Moses was not a semi-barbarous Jew, but either a secularly scientific or an inspired man. And if we cannot accept the former hypothesis, and think it unlikely that imparted information and unaided intellect could have originated this consummate production, then we must avow the latter conviction, that he was truly a man of God. But was the sanitary code that goes by his name, or styled the Sinaitic, his conception or not? This question Moses himself answers indirectly and often, and takes no credit for but disclaims it. Assuredly Moses was not only a man of science, and the foremost sanitarian of his own or any other age, but also a man gifted by his Maker with the faculty to discover and appreciate not only the great fundamental facts and elements, but also many of the more important minutiae of private, public, and national sanitation. Still he takes no credit for the sanitary utterances of the Pentateuch, or even says or hints at their being partly, chiefly or wholly self-generated, and his own unaided creation, or that we are purely indebted for them to the genius of their practical expounder. Over and over again he insists and reiterates that they are solely heaven-sent and of divine origin. Nay, more, what he says appears to suggest that his sanitary code was a premeditated and authoritative emanation. which in its elaboration probably occupied more years than any work that has since been handed down to posterity. In early times, medical treatises were more slowly elaborated than now, and swayed only by the double patriotism of zeal for his master and loyalty to his people. Moses had no need to give hasty and incomplete work to the world. In the desert he would have ample time to write his book of the law and the early story of man and the earth leisurely. From the Holy Bible alone we glean the great base facts about the Mosaic law and its hygienic portion. Here we learn, and by Moses' own handwriting, that he was not their author, but Jehovah himself, that Moses only gave or wrote the law as averred by the Savior. John chapter 7, verse 19. Therefore, that it is divine and inspired. Moses was merely its earthly recipient and transcriber and applicant. This great fact practically attested by over 2 millions of Hebrews who heard the voice of God delivering the Decalogue at Sinai, materially enhances the value of the bequest, as its supernal nature and origin attests its truth and infallibility. This great honor reserved for Moses, and the culminating fact in his earth history, stamps his character and place in history. Taught by the divinity as no other man has yet been, Moses thus became earth's greatest sanitarian and the deity's ambassador and mouthpiece to man in sanitary as in many other matters. What Moses wrote was revealed. He penned as he was inspired and wrote what Jehovah dictated in the Holy of Holies. Moses himself attests this, and thus wholly disclaims the authorship. Chapter after chapter begins thus, "And the Lord said," Leviticus chapter 27, and thus the Hebrew leader and sage, as has been recorded by his successor Joshua, himself full of the spirit of wisdom, Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 9, fully deserves this record. There arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 10 to 11. The distinction between the meats allowed to the Hebrews and those not allowed remains down to the present day an extremely valuable canon of preventive medicine. The carnivorous animals were not to be eaten and were declared unclean. They are, as modern science has abundantly shown, much more likely to be the subject of parasites of various kinds than are the herbivorous animals. Any animal that died of itself or had been torn by beasts was not to be eaten, and this was an extremely wise provision, for those that had died were very likely to be the subject of serious disease, while those torn by wild animals, if they did not perish at once, were likely to have pyemia or septicemia set in their wounds, while if they had been killed at once and their bodies had been exposed for any length of time in the open air, they were likely to become the subject of serious putrefactive changes from the growth of bacteria in them. Any of these processes were likely to make the meat toxic, and the one safeguard was prohibition of their consumption. The Hebrews were not allowed to take the blood of animals, hence the necessity for having cattle butchered in their own way so that it might be kosher. And it is interesting to realize that this prohibition probably meant much for the prevention of disease. Meat that is well drained of blood keeps longer than that which contains the tissue fluids, and it has come to be felt that the protection of the Hebrews to a considerable extent against tuberculosis, so that their death rate from this disease is much lower than that of other races living under similar circumstances, is perhaps due to their abstinence from blood according to their law. They were forbidden to eat many of the fats, and this was hygienic in general, for the fat is a sluggish tissue and may contain parasites. But above all this was important for preventing the Hebrews from eating such an amount of fat as would make them obese and sluggish. The Orthodox Jews of the present time who fail to keep this prohibition as to fat are weighted down with a load of surplus fatty tissue that takes away from their activity and shortens their lives. Obesity has certain relations directly with diabetes, which also makes this fat prohibition of significance. And as the Jew is probably more subject to diabetes than most of those living in similar circumstances, there is here another index of the value of this Mosaic law which prevented pathological tendencies of several kinds that now make themselves manifest. The greatest weight was placed upon keeping food materials covered from the air, and the use of liquids kept in vessels that were uncovered is forbidden, as is likewise the eating of fruit with open moist cracks. It has often been said in modern times that the paring of fruits, when unbroken, constitutes the best possible safeguard against spoiling, and many have the feeling that this fact was discovered or its significance properly recognized only since we have been studying fermentation and putrefaction. It was known long ago, however. It was recognized also that food materials should not be handled except with the greatest precautions, and that those who prepared them should practice careful cleansing. These regulations undoubtedly had much to do with the prevention of the spread of the infectious diseases. We have learned in recent years that cooks have had much to do with the spread of the intestinal infections, and we now recognize the need of the meticulous precautions on which Moses insisted. The place of the hands in conveying disease was emphasized very much, as for instance by Jewish writers who insisted on the rule that coin should never be placed in the mouth because they had been handled by so many people. We have now come to appreciate this thoroughly, after having suspected for some time that the hands have more to do with the conveyance of contagion in many diseases than almost any other factor. A series of experiments made upon young sailors in the United States service after the armistice was signed and when the flu was at its height demonstrated almost beyond doubt that influenza cannot be conveyed by breathing or coughing into the faces of others, nor in any way through the air. Most army surgeons came to the conclusion, therefore, that the mode of conveyance of the disease was by the hands, which in handling food and in touching the mouth and nose transmitted infectious material which had been gathered in various ways. It is interesting then to realize that the Jewish law insisted on careful cleansing of the hands before eating and on not touching the mouth or nose before the hands were washed in the morning, and that the Talmudic writings emphasized these regulations as regards the cleansing of the hands. They required that the fingernails, when pared, should be burnt. Some of the Talmudists suggested that if water could not be obtained, gloves should be worn while eating, which would recall the use of surgical gloves in modern times. For the surgeons learned long since that the hands were by far the most dangerous media for the transmission of infection. Some years ago Sir Benjamin Ward Richardson, one of the most distinguished of the English physicians of the latter half of the 19th century, pointed out that the record showed a very marked difference in the health and death rate of the Jews living in various cities of Great Britain as compared to their Gentile neighbors, and always in favor of the Jews. Other statistics gathered later in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th emphasize the fact that there is manifestly something which enables the Jew to resist disease and maintain health under circumstances where the people around him suffer much more severely than he does. For instance, in Manchester the average annual death rate for 3 years in the 2 Jewish districts was over 8 in one and over 9 in the other, below the death rate per 1,000 of the whole city. The 2 Jewish districts were among the worst slums of Manchester, Yet not only do they exhibit a much lower death rate, but the morbidity statistics show that there is less sickness among the Jews from all the serious infectious diseases than among the Gentiles. They had a higher morbidity rate than all the other parts of the city for erysipelas, pyemia, and puerperal fever, showing that they were subjected to the influence of dirt and septic contagion. But in everything else they were much lower in the sickness rate than their neighbors. They had only about 1/2 as many premature births. Their children suffered from only half as many convulsions, and scarcely more than half as much from diarrhea and dysentery. The children in the Jewish districts proved to be particularly capable of resisting disease, and their death rate is distinctly lower. The diuretic diseases of childhood are practically all due to improper feeding, and the saving of children's lives in the unsanitary Jewish districts where poverty stalks abroad so openly is due to the more healthy feeding of the infants, but above all to the mother's very careful care of them. The Jewish mother is, by age-long tradition, an absolutely unselfish caretaker of her children. When they are ailing, her devotion is constant, and nothing is too much for her to do. No wonder that she saves more of her children than the Gentile mothers around her. It is because of the presence of the Jewish mothers in New York and Boston that our boards of health have come upon the startling discovery that the foreign-born mother in this country raises 1 in 7 more of her children than does the native-born mother. The reason? Of course. For this is maternal devotion and readiness to sacrifice herself in any and every way for the sake of her children. At least twice as many of these foreign mothers, and among these of course every Orthodox Jewish mother who can possibly do it, nurse their children, and that is by far the most important factor in securing the survival of children beyond the first year. The Jews have been particularly careful for the lives of their infant children both before and after birth. It is considered a disgrace for a Jewish mother to have a premature birth, for it is felt that some blame attaches to the mother. As for the prevalent practice of abortion, there is almost none of it among the poor Jewish populations, and none at all until their Orthodox Jewry begins to break down under the influence of contact with their Gentile neighbors. Human life is a very sacred thing to the Orthodox Jew, and no matter how small or insignificant that life may be, it has all the qualities of humanity for him and appeals to his protection. The solicitude of the Jewish mother for her children has been the subject of poet and painter all down the ages and is to be found as well developed and as strikingly manifest in the slums of the large cities of the West, where it is so extremely difficult of exercise as it was in the Jewish towns of the olden time. In Leeds, toward the end of the 19th century, there were some 15,000 Jews, the great majority of them belonging to the very poorest class. Most of them lived in the central ward of the city, as pointed out by Dr. Porritt in Religion and Health. That ward, one of the most squalid in Leeds, had a death rate lower than that of the whole city, the statistical records for which show all the advantages derived from the healthier or better class districts. In London itself, in Whitechapel and Mile End, which were principally occupied by Jews, the death rates were only 18.5 and 19.3 per thousand of population, while in the neighboring districts of Limehouse and St. George, where there were many fewer Jews, Limehouse being practically without them, the death rates were respectively 23 and 24.6 per thousand. There was distinctly less morbidity from the infectious diseases in the Jewish districts, there being actually more than 1/4 more in Limehouse than in Mile End on the average, and the infantile death rates were much lower among the Jews in spite of the fact that most of them were immigrants who had led very hard and anxious lives before settling in London, and since coming had to work under unwanted, exceedingly unsanitary conditions. in a climate to which they were not as yet accustomed. In other countries besides England, the mortality and morbidity statistics favor the Jew even more strikingly than in England. In Frankfurt on Main, as pointed out by Sir Benjamin Ward Richardson, where the influence of the Jewish ghetto still made itself felt about the middle of the 19th century, and Jews were herded together under restricted regulations that would seem inevitably prone to hurt their health. They had, as a matter of fact, ever so much better health than the Gentiles around them. The average duration of life among the Jews was 48 years and 9 months. Among all other classes it was 36 years and 11 months. More than half of the Jews reached 50 years of age, while scarcely more than 1/3 of the other classes lived up to that. During the first 5 years of life, Jewish children died at the rate of about 13%, while Gentile children died at the rate of a little more than 24%. 1/4 of the Jewish population attained the age of 70. 1/4 of the rest of the inhabitants lived to be less than 60. In Firth, the tenacity of life among the Jews could be noted at all ages. Of the Jewish children from 1 to 5 years, 10% died, but among the rest of the population the infant mortality of the same age was 14%. At every stage of life Jewish mortality was lower until past the age of 60, when, owing to the greater number of Jews who reached advanced age, the ratio was inverted. The number of Jews who lived to be above 80 and even 90 is strikingly larger than among the Gentiles. In Prussia, Legoit found that the average life of the Jew is greater than that of the Gentile by at least 5 years. The mortality among the population of the whole kingdom was a little over 2 1/2 per 100, while among the Jews it was only 1 1/2 per 100. The population in Prussia is increasing annually at the rate of 1 1/3 per 100 among non-Jews, but at the rate of nearly 1 3/4 among the Jews. The ordinary population requires 51 years to double itself, but the Jews require only 41½ years for the same progression. Sir Benjamin Ward Richardson, by a comparison of the ages of 2,500 Jews buried in London in 3 years with the mortality of the whole population of London at different ages, found that under 5 years of age 44 Jews died to 45 non-Jews. From 35 to 45 years of age, 5 Jews died to every 8 non-Jews. And it was not until the age of 85 was reached that the ratio was reversed and 2 Jews were buried to every 1 non-Jew, there being considerably more than twice as many non-Jews alive at that age to supply the bodies for the burial. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Religion and Health. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Owlivia. Religion and Health by James Joseph Walsh. Chapter 19, Health and Religion. Religion, as we have seen in the course of this book, does very much for health. But, according to the great principle of nature, reaction is equal to action in compensation, and health undoubtedly also accomplishes very much for religion. Indeed, there are a great many troubles commonly presumed to be of the spirit, and a great many supposed disturbances of the spiritual life, that are really only manifestations of ill health of one kind or another, or at least some hampering of bodily function reflected in the mind. This has always been recognized by all the great authorities in the spiritual life, and none have insisted more than the writers even of the highest mystical theology on the necessity for taking proper care of the body if the spirit is to be free for religious life. Desolation, that is, that feeling of utter dissatisfaction with religious exercises and difficulty in continuing them, of which so much is said in spiritual literature, is very often nothing more than dyspepsia. What is familiarly called the blues, or the blue devils, That is the state of depression in which nothing seems hopeful and the future seems very blank indeed, is a common experience among mankind generally, and is very often dependent on some disturbance of the digestive tract. There is a well-known expression in English according to which the answer to the question, "Is life worth living?" is, "That depends on the liver," meaning not only the person that does the living, but also that large organ in the upper right abdominal quadrant, the largest, heaviest organ in the body, disturbances of which, it is no wonder, cause serious interference with a number of the functions of both mind and body. Many a long-faced person, indeed, who thinks himself pious, is only bilious, and many a sad-eyed visionary who is quite ready to proclaim himself religious is only what the ancients called atrabilious, and needs some liver regulator as badly as ever Horace thought he needed hellebore in the spring. There are a good many traits of disposition or habits of life, often supposed to be dependent on the state of the spirit, that are really only symptoms of bodily indisposition. Many a fit of temper is consequent on the condition of the digestive organs rather than the state of the soul. Suspicion and jealousy are not infrequently not so much vices as unfortunate feelings exaggerated out of all reason by some disturbance of health. There are certain times in women's lives particularly when almost any feeling that comes to them is magnified and takes on a significance quite beyond the reality. Physicians constantly have to remind their women patients to wait a few days and not let their inhibited feelings run away with them, as they are so prone to do at certain periods. Not a little of the irritability of life, and especially the exaggerated response to minor irritations, is due to insufficient oxygenation of tissues, because the individual concerned is not getting out into the air sufficiently. At the end of a number of hours of mental work indoors, especially in a stuffy atmosphere, most people are inclined to be irritable. If, instead of going out into the fresh air and staying out for some time when they get the chance, they think that they feel too tired for the effort which that involves, and prefer to rest in a comfortable chair or perhaps lying down, their irritability will often not be lessened, but sometimes will even be heightened. On the other hand, if they get out into the brisk, bracing cold air of the wintertime particularly, they come back with their irritability thoroughly dissipated as a rule, and ready to go on with their work almost without a sense of weariness. Probably nothing makes a man say his night prayers more unsatisfactorily and with less devotion than to sit down in a nice, comfortable chair after a rather heavy evening meal and smoke and read the paper or perhaps a magazine until he goes to sleep. He wakes up feeling all out of sorts, while if he played a game of cards with friends, he would feel fine at the end of the evening and be ready to thank the Lord for another day and for the prospect of a good night's rest for the work ahead. Above all, people who are living healthy outdoor lives are much more prone to take a happy view of life, to see the bright side of things, and to radiate goodwill and sunshine than those who are overmuch in the house. The cheerful givers whom the Lord loves come especially from among these. A great many people who want to pour out their ills perennially, because they like to indulge their self-pity by rolling the delectable morsels of their sufferings under their tongues, and who go around seeking consolation and sympathy whenever they are in even slight trouble, are indoor people. They occur especially among those who spend a good deal of time sitting down and not exercising their bodies enough. The good old rule, ora et labora, is an extremely valuable precept, not only for the next world, but also for this. Pray and labor, but be sure that labor gets a fair share of the time, and be sure that the body has enough exercise to keep it going and to keep its functions in good condition. Otherwise, the prayer will be disturbed, and life will be far from happy. Happiness comes to those who are healthily tired every day. Long ago, Dooley said in one of those wise sayings of his, which made even the London Times declare that the wisest man that was writing English in our day wrote under the name of Dooley in Chicago, that the one thing above all that made life worth living was to be tired enough at the end of every day so that one would sleep well every night. Without that, life is indeed a burden. The practice of hard work, some of it physical, is a very good rule for the physical as well as the spiritual life. A hard-working man has little time to be grouchy and to throw wet blankets over the good that others are trying to do. he is likely to be a lifter and not a leaner, a doer and not a talker. Nothing keeps people from finding fault so well as having so much to do that they can scarcely find the time in which to do it all. Especially this is important for those who have to spend a good deal of time in each other's company, and who must learn to bear with each other's faults and go on with their own work to the best of their ability. It must not be forgotten that a great many of the faults of others are to be attributed rather to the state of their health than to their disposition, and, once this is rightly understood, charity will readily help us to gloss them over or to forgive them. Anyone who makes his own faults the subject of excuse on the score of health, when his health is something that, by a little care, he could improve, is, of course, imposing on himself, if he does it at all deliberately, and he is trying to impose on good nature if he thinks that other people do not appreciate that his ill health is really an excuse and not a reason for his faults. In the chapter on abstinence, it is suggested that one of the best things that men, and particularly women, could practice to advantage from the standpoint of religious abstinence would be abstinence from excessive rest. Rest is one of the most dangerous remedies that we have, nearly as dangerous as opium, and with a definite tendency for a habit to be acquired by the system for it, whenever it is indulged in to excess, exactly as is true of the opiates. If mortification of the spirit were to be practiced by abstinence from over-rest and by a definite amount of exercise every day, it would be an excellent thing for the religious as well as the physical life. This is one of the most frequent advices of those interested in spiritual life as well as the bodily health for many generations. What people need is to keep busy. This is good for both their minds and their bodies. It requires a great deal of mortification of the inclinations to keep at work, and above all, to take exercise voluntarily, when one might sit around and enjoy the delightfully lazy feeling of doing nothing. But that way lies serious disturbance of health. The men who have been very hard workers, especially from a sense of duty and not for mere selfish reasons, taking a great deal of exercise, and going to bed so thoroughly tired every night that they went to sleep as soon as their head touched the pillow, have been long-lived as a rule, unless they met with some accident or infection. Above all, it is important for anyone who wishes to retain his self-respect, and to keep from that sluggishness which is so fatal to the power to pray and to meditate, not to permit his abdominal and flank muscles to become overstretched, and to allow fat to accumulate within the abdomen until it is actually a burden. There is almost no excuse for anyone permitting his waistline to become larger in girth than his chest, unless of course he happens to have some deformity that makes exercise very difficult or practically impossible. To keep these muscles in good condition prevents slouchiness and makes the individual ever so much more ready for activity of any kind. The only way that these muscles can be kept in tone to hold in the abdomen properly and keep the circulation within it in such vigor as will support the digestive tract so as to permit and encourage its proper activities is by exercising them. This requires the performance of certain exercises every day. Stooping, bending, stretching, all these must be practiced if the muscles are not to be allowed to degenerate. There is no harder task than to keep up the custom of performing these exercises regularly a couple of times a day, for, though only from 5 to 10 minutes is needed, night and morning, to maintain the muscles in condition, or even to restore them when they have once begun to sag, all sorts of excuses come in to prevent the regular practice of exercises, and it is the regularity above all that counts. A man who keeps these muscles in good shape will be much readier for every sort of activity than if he allowed them to yield, and one of the secrets of the army officer's power as the years go on, so that, quite contrary to the usual rule in life, it is men well beyond 60 who make some of the greatest successes as leaders, is because their regular training and discipline keep them from letting their muscles lose tone and their powers degenerate. The setting up exercises of the Army or Navy, indulged in for 15 minutes a day, and this could be divided into 2 periods, would keep men in condition and prove at the same time a very salutary mortification and, above all, an exercise in self-control and persistent application to a good purpose they would constitute a magnificent factor for that training of the will that is so important for religion. Nerve irritation is oftener a function of insufficient exercise and air with overfeeding than of any other factor. This same thing is true for suspicion and jealousy and envy and other of the supposed inner emotions of the soul. They will disappear very often before the fresh air, while they will be fostered by life indoors and by the coddling of ills by rest, and high living generally. The passions, by which a great many people mean mainly the sexual feelings, though of course they also include the tendency to overeat, and especially to stimulate one's self to eating in various ways, are all fostered by being much indoors and not getting enough fresh outdoor air, and particularly cold air. There are a great many people who seem to forget that air is absolutely the most important requisite for life, and that when it is cold, it takes heat away from the animal body and sets all the cell functions working at their best. Human beings are practically heat engines, and we keep on manufacturing heat all the time. As our temperature never rises except when we suffer from fever, some outlet must be found for this heat, and unless there is exposure to the air, and especially air in motion that will carry heat away from us, the heat is consumed in various large organs and almost invariably succeeds in making us quite miserable. It is under these circumstances of sluggish indoor living particularly that irritability of all kinds is heightened, and that the tendency to lack of self-control is most manifest. It is a form of intoxication, actually, that comes over people, and would remind us not a little of the intoxication that follows from smaller amounts of alcohol with resultant lack of inhibition. When people are much out in the air, it is surprising what they can stand in the shape of injury without great suffering. Our young soldiers learned during the war that their outdoor life in camps and at the front made the slighter wounds appear almost as nothing to them, and even the severer wounds caused them nothing like the pain which they had anticipated, or which they actually would have caused if the soldiers continued to be in the same state of mind and body as regards the reaction to pain which had been true during their civilian days. It requires much less courage to be heroic when one has been living the outdoor life and has been hardening muscles by exercise and plain food, and not too much sleep, than when one is living the indoor, relaxed, over-rested life. That does not lessen the merit of what they did, but helps to account for its development in just ordinary mortals, and above all, helps to explain why now they modestly prefer not to talk about it, for to them it seems to have been just all in a day's work. Not infrequently, oversensitiveness of disposition, which resents even the slightest imputation, and which is often prone to translate what was a mere conventional remark into a fancied insult, is due to lack of sufficient outdoor air to keep the individual in good health. On the other hand, men and women who spend a good deal of time outside are capable of standing even severe insults without wincing under them, and sometimes this rebounds greatly to the benefit of the cause for which they are working. Father Lockington has dwelt on this in one of his chapters rather interestingly. Quote, "Good health helps us to be patient and silent under insult and wrong, when this makes for duty better done. The souls for whom we labor are often unreasonable, often ungrateful, often crooked, but the trained worker never hesitates. Strong and self-contained, he moves serenely on. No display of temper mars his work. No hasty word is uttered, however great the provocation. Like the missionary calmly wiping his face when spat upon in the Japanese street, or that little sister of the poor who, struck across the face when begging food for her old people, calmly answered, 'That is for myself, and I deserve it. Please now give me something for Christ's poor.' Such a worker sees only souls here below, and Christ above, waiting for them. A healthy body will keep the mind broad and even. It has no place for brooding suspicion to lurk. It will help the soul to take a wide view of life, and prevent that narrowness of thought, so fatal to work, to which our life of continual introspection tends." End quote. A great many of the vicious impulses in connection with suspicion and jealousy and envy may be traced to a lack of diversion in life. There are some people who take no pains to organize existence in such a way that they have a definite diversion at certain times. Every human being ought, at some time on every Sunday, to decide that on certain days of the following week, and above all on certain evenings, he will do things in which he is particularly interested, and which he can look forward to with pleasant anticipation. Those who can should arrange either to go to the theater, or to a lecture in which they are interested, or to visit friends whom they care to see, or to go to a library and look up something that they have been wanting to find out about, or, if it is pleasant weather, to go for a short excursion, or a boat ride, or something of that kind, and they should make 2 or 3 appointments with themselves for definite occasions of recreation for the ensuing week. As a rule, all that is necessary for this is to make up one's mind to do it, though there is a tendency on the part of a great many people just to let each evening be like every other evening, and because of a lack of sufficient interest, they lose that variety which is the spice of life. As a result, existence becomes dreadfully monotonous, and those who live such narrow lives become the subjects of all sorts of unfortunate suggestions with regard to those around them. Over and over again, I have found that when women patients particularly were the subjects of various of these nervous irritabilities, so that they were permitting themselves actually to be led into being deluded into various suspicions, there was a prompt disappearance or significant minimization of these thoughts when diversions were properly introduced into their lives. The founders of religious orders were very wise in this matter. In all the religious orders, the members are required by rule to spend a certain time in recreation, that is, in conversation and lighter occupation, usually several times every day. This must be spent in company with the others, and the members of the house are not allowed to absent themselves without good reason. Young religious sometimes feel like resenting the rule requiring them to be present day after day at recreation, as if it represented a waste of time, but they learn later on in life how wise it is. The various feast days of the church are celebrated in such a way that there is a definite diversion from the usual routine of life, and then there are the special indulgences at table, and the matter of spending time in the open, and receiving visitors, and other things of that kind, which mean a very great deal in breaking the monotony of the religious life. Very often scruples are, as we have pointed out in the chapter on nervous diseases, only a manifestation of a nervous disposition, sometimes on a hereditary, but sometimes on an acquired basis. The acquired basis is very often a lack of nutrition due to insufficient food, for people who are underweight are much more subject to dreads and obsessions of all kinds than those who are up to weight. Living on the will, as it is called, when one is underweight and does not eat very much, certainly not sufficient to supply the energy for what has to be accomplished, is a fruitful source of irritability of any and every kind. It keeps people on edge, that is, in a condition of unstable equilibrium, and almost anything that touches them has a tendency to put them into a state of disequilibrium. Bringing people up to normal health, and especially up to normal weight, is often the best possible means to lessen their tendencies to scruples and to various other manifestations supposed to be spiritual, yet which represent only conditions and symptoms that are frequently seen in those who have no religion and no conscious obligations with regard to anything. It is surprising how often a sluggish state of the bowels proves to be seriously disturbing to the spiritual life. People find it hard to pray without distraction, or to meditate without getting sleepy, and they are liable to think of themselves as perhaps being the object of very special attention on the part of certain evil spirits who make it their business to distract and obtund those who are trying to put themselves in communication with the Most High, when all that is really the matter is that they are absorbing certain materials which ought to be excreted promptly, but which are being delayed in their intestinal tract longer than is good for the individual. I am not one of those who believe that intestinal autotoxemia is a very serious condition which produces dire results, but I know very well that absorption in any quantity of residual materials from the intestinal tract that were meant to be excreted will produce languor and sluggishness. The present fad among certain physicians for attributing a great many serious symptoms to intestinal auto-intoxication has no basis in physiological chemistry, and represents only one of those exaggerations of a minor truth for which medicine is so famous. The idea of self-poisoning, which is all that auto-intoxication means, is a very old one in medicine, and the use of drastic purgatives, such as calomel in large doses, and the antimonial purges, and then of bloodletting, represent the responses to this idea which doctors made in an older time. We know that they did harm, and those who would exaggerate the meaning of auto-intoxication in our time are likely to do just as much harm. But there is no doubt at all that obstipation will make the majority of human beings uncomfortable and take away their initiative and keep them from being up to their best in mental and spiritual matters. To use some of the greatly advertised remedies or modes of treatment which are suggested for it, however, would probably do more harm than good. There are a number of simple, sensible methods of treatment by which the affection may be overcome. Above all, the formation of good habits, of taking an abundance of water, of eating coarse food, the peelings of baked potatoes and the parings of baked apples, and an occasional orange with its peel, and using marmalade rather freely, as well as eating whole wheat bread, will gradually overcome the condition. The important thing is not to mistake the merely physical affection for a spiritual disturbance. It requires persistence to form good habits, and it is ever so much easier just to take something that will supposedly do the same good work while you sleep, and are not bothered by the exertion of the willpower necessary to form the habits that are required. Many a disturbance of health is due to sloth and laziness, rather than to ignorance of what ought to be done, or to any inherent tendency to ill in the body. Any number of people blame Providence for ills which they have brought on themselves by neglect of their own health and the habits necessary to maintain it. Nothing so conduces to good health as the regularity of life, without haste and without worry, which the rational practice of religion brings in its train. The attitude of mind that a trusting faith in the Almighty fosters is particularly likely to prevent the neurotic symptoms and exaggerations of feelings which are responsible for so much of the modern suffering of mankind. It makes the real pains and aches ever so much more bearable, and eliminates those which to a great extent are imaginary. The success of all sorts of curious therapeutic systems, which prove, after a time, to be utterly without beneficial effect on the human body, shows how much faith in anything may mean for health and restoration to health, even in the midst of what is supposed to be rather serious illness. And as men are bound to have faith in something, and a living faith in a providence that somehow, even though we may not be able to understand it, cares for men, drawing good even out of evil, can accomplish an immense amount in making men less amenable to suffering, even in this world. It would be too bad to reduce religion merely to this status, but this should be one of its benefits. As the Scriptures said, "For it is not a vain thing for you, because it is your life, and through this thing you shall prolong your days in the land." End of chapter 19. Recording by Owlivia. End of Religion and Health by James Joseph Walsh.